Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection has changed everything. For many years, the only official way to play the majority of video games on home consoles that are part of Marvel vs. Capcom's rich lineage has been to dig out retro physical copies, then play them on expensive classic hardware. This has meant for many years fans of the series have been crying out for re-releases. That way fans would not only have easy access to these great titles, but instantly be able to experience them online too. While on the surface such a demand may sound fairly simple to meet, many speculated that such re-releases would never happen due to the unfortunate turn of events that saw Disney buy up Marvel. Not many people believed that such titles fit in well with Disney's cinematic universe vision, particularly when we take into account what a disaster Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was. However, now that hell has frozen over and 7 games from this property's rich heritage are heading to modern hardware, today we will not only be discussing all of the new features this collection is set to offer, but also be taking a trip down memory lane and looking at which each of these phenomenal entries brought to the table. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is everything there is to know about Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, the release that just changed everything. Yeah. When it comes to modern Capcom, whether you love their modern games like Street Fighter 6 or not, one thing I think we should certainly praise them for are their awesome retro collections they have been compiling to be experienced on newer platforms. Not only are these amazing and featuring huge selections of games, but I can get you many of them for next to nothing. Want the Mega Man Legacy Collection? With my affiliate link it's only $1.91. Or you can get up to 80% off of the amazing Mega Man X or Zero collections too. On the fighting game front, how about 63% off of the Capcom Fighting Collection, containing Darkstalkers, Red Earth, Street Fighter and more. Get these great bargains and up to 90% off of thousands of AAA games using my affiliate link, and with each purchase it goes towards funding long boy videos like this, making binge shopping for dirt cheap heavily reduced games a huge win for both of us. So grab a game or two whenever you feel like it. Soon to join this list of awesome collections, we of course have the now highly anticipated Marvel vs. Capcom Collection, which aside from featuring 7 games, all of which we are going to discuss in depth soon, it also offers a number of other quality of life benefits. This release, which looks to take us for a ride, promises us all that all of the fighting games in the collection will have online ranked, casual and lobby matches unlocked for players to showcase their abilities from the get-go. Further to this, robust rollback netcode is being brought to the table, guaranteeing to us a strong and stable online experience. Building on this, global high score leaderboards are being introduced, as well as a training mode for each game, allowing users to refine their skills. In addition, a spectator mode will also function as part of the package, so we can watch other combatants battle it out, as well as the inclusion of a music jukebox and an in-game museum. Perfect for fighting game historians to enjoy, such as myself. Amongst the fighting games, players will also be able to enjoy The Punisher, a beat-em-up arcade game and a title that got the ball rolling for the many Marvel vs. Capcom games in the first place. This quality game will make a fine addition to anyone's collection, and I promise we will look at this one in depth later in this upload. However, for now, let's turn our attention to the first fighting game that was released, which functions as part of this collection. Let's discuss the simply brilliant X-Men, Children of the Atom. Yeah! Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, Marvel had allowed a number of different developers and publishers to produce games that took advantage of their famous licenses. The majority of these were pretty terrible, relying on the Marvel brand to carry the product rather than the gameplay itself. Most of these were home computer games functioning as budget titles, developed in Europe, and on home consoles they were usually rush jobs published by Acclaim, often under their infamous LJN branding. While usually disappointing on the home front, the realm of arcade games was different. Servicing from Japan, arcade offerings would be produced, such as Sega's Spider-Man, Data East's Captain America and the Avengers, and who could ever forget Konami's X-Men. All of these were fantastic beat-em-ups that had been designed to eat players' coins around the world. Konami's X-Men beat-em-up and Capcom's X-Men fighting game may both be excellent titles that feature these mighty mutants, but the reality is that Children of the Atom has a closer beat-em-up relative. Among the brilliant games of this genre, we of course had The Punisher, an impressive title that was produced in this arcade brawler golden age, which was a lot of fun to play. This technical, to excuse the pun, marvel was very well produced and allowed players to fight against more than 10 enemies on screen at once without any signs of slowdown. This would mark the first ever Capcom developed video game that would feature Marvel characters. However, as you all know, this would be far from the last. Marvel was extremely pleased with the Punisher game and was keen to continue their working relationship with Capcom. But it wasn't just the Punisher that had impressed the American comic book giant, but an even more lucrative video game Capcom had made. I'm of course talking about Street Fighter 2. Little is needed to be said about this one, as it is easily one of the most successful and innovative arcade games to have ever graced this earth. Considering that it is often credited for rejuvenating an entire industry and carving out the modern fighting game niche in its image forever, it's no wonder that Street Fighter 2 perked Marvel's interest. Marvel could see the lucrativeness of this game, so they wanted a slice of Street Fighter 2 pie for themselves. Scott Smith, a product manager who worked for Capcom USA at the time, in an interview with Polygon adds that it's weird considering where Marvel is today, but Marvel wanted to get into the market in Japan, and I think they were looking for opportunities, and video games were one of them, to penetrate the market and kind of make their properties a little more well known. Katsuya Akitomo, who would work as an advisor and artist working on Children of the Atom, adds, Konami had just released X-Men, which was a big hit for them. I think it was entertaining enough, and people talked about it, but the thing is, a lot of players in Japan thought the game was unfair. For a lot of Japanese gamers, fairness is one of the most important elements of the gameplay experience, so because of that, it didn't do well in the Japanese market at all. Also, even though the 1991 X-Men comic had come out by then, Konami's X-Men arcade game was based on an animated pilot. I think only one episode ended up being made, so by the time Konami's arcade game came out, it just seemed kind of old and the visuals were obviously different from what the comic book had shown us, so I thought it wasn't really that interesting and it was a little too old, so I felt that we could do better. Alex Jimenez, who would provide design support for the game, adds Marvel was not doing well financially, you know. They were on the rocks, really on the rocks, and they were more than willing to license us the characters quickly and easily. So they gave us X-Men, and we took it and ran with it from there. Once the deal was struck to create this game, Capcom still needed to appoint someone with a lot of experience to direct the game, so would turn their attention to Akira Nishitani of Street Fighter 2 success. He was given a choice of whether to work on X-Men or Street Fighter 3, with him rather boldly opting to work on Children of the Atom. The game's planner, Takeshi Tezuka, comments on Nishitani opting to work with them, adding, when you deal with a franchise like Street Fighter, it's a fighting game, but the characters are basically human and thus limited to realistic, albeit greatly exaggerated movements. But with the Marvel series, you're dealing with superheroes who can do anything, and there had been lots of requests to do something different, so I thought it was a good idea. X-Men Children of the Atom first hit the arcades in December of 1994 and was a game that took advantage of the power of a CP System 2 arcade board. 1994 was an interesting year for Capcom and their fighting game endeavours. Not only did we see the release of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the most refined version of Street Fighter 2 yet, but we also received a feature-length Street Fighter movie. To cash in on the style of play, Capcom would also make some brand new fighting games, such as Darkstalkers, Muscle Bomber 2, and of course X-Men Children of the Atom. A lot was going on. In their own ways, each of these titles were impressive, but perhaps the X-Men game was the most intriguing of the lot, due to the fact that the characters already had a fan base and an established universe. But what else would be put in that would help make this one so special? Akira Yasuda, also of Street Fighter 2 fame, would work as an artist on Children of the Atom, and he comments, while some of the characters in the Street Fighter series could be said to have superhuman powers, for the Marvel games we did, like Children of the Atom, all of the characters were defined by being mutants with superpowers. So from the get-go, we decided to try and make their special moves more intense and flashy. Prominent fighting game community member James Chen, when speaking to Polygon, adds that the combo system was so freeform and it was so revolutionary at the time that nobody knew how to do any of the stuff. You could launch people, go into air combos and all that stuff, and nobody was doing it. Capcom would do a top-notch job with this game, delivering an experience that was faithful in capturing the spirit of its namesake comics, by using colourful animation and even the use of voice actors from the X-Men animated series. The game featured a basic story that is supposedly loosely based on the franchise's Fatal Attraction storyline. So within the game's plot, members of the X-Men set up a fighting tournament to determine who is strong enough to defeat the mutant supervillain Magneto. You know, the lunatic who wishes to eliminate the human population from his space station Avalon in order to free the oppressed mutants. The game starts out with a roster of 10 characters on the player select screen, with heroes and villains both being playable. On the hero side, we have Cyclops, the mutant known for his ability to emit powerful beams of energy from his eyes. We then have Storm, who can fly and attack with wind, ice and lightning based moves, and Wolverine, who has retractable claws, animal keen senses, enhanced physical capabilities, and a powerful regenerative ability known as a healing factor. We then have Iceman, who has the ability to manipulate ice and cold by freezing water vapour around him, Colossus, who can transform himself into a metallic form, making him as hard as nails, and finally, the lovely Psylocke, who has the ability to use psychic energy combined with fighting techniques. Speaking of Psylocke, she did not become one of the X-Men until 1986, as prior to that she was more heavily associated with another Marvel comic book series known as Captain Britain. Sadly, Captain Britain has not appeared in any fighting games, which I personally think is rather criminal. Captain Britain as a superhero is said to uphold the laws of Britain, so I guess maybe he's too busy collecting TV licensing fees or something. In terms of villains to players in the game, we have Omega Red, an evil serial killer born in Soviet Russia, who was experimented on by the USSR. In the game, he uses his carbonadium tentacles to increase his attack range. We then have a Sentinel who is playable too. Sentinels are mutant hunting robots and are in fact heavily featured within the X-Men animated series of the 90s, and in this game function as the largest playable character. There is also Silver Samurai, who was a villain originally from a 1974 Daredevil comic, who is a Japanese mutant who uses his power to charge his katana. He wears samurai style armour made of a silvery metal. He is notable for being the only character in this game who cannot kick, but instead uses a variety of slashes with his sword. When we take into account the Marvel Capcom deal was partially made to assist the American comic brand growing in the Japanese market, it makes you wonder if this was the reason as to why he was chosen to be in this game. The last initially selectable fighter is Spiral, who has 6 arms she can use to attack with at the same time, in addition to her levitating swords and shape-changing abilities. Further to this, we have the boss characters, the first of which is the Juggernaut, bitch. This large, powerful opponent is in fact a regular human who was empowered by a gem belonging to a deity. Becoming a literal human Juggernaut, he possesses superhuman strength and durability, and even wears a helmet to protect him from psychic abilities. Although not a mutant, the Juggernaut has been featured as a prominent member of the Brotherhood of Mutants. In a simple playthrough, the game's final boss fight takes place against Magneto, a powerful mutant and one of the fictional subspecies of humanity born with superhuman abilities, who has the ability to regenerate and control magnetic fields. Magneto regards mutants as evolutionary superior to humans, and rejects the possibility of peaceful human-mutant coexistence. He initially aimed to conquer the world to enable mutants, whom he refers to as Homo superior, to replace humans as the dominant species. Marvel aficionados will be able to tell you that the character is a bit more layered than that though, as it is revealed that Magneto hates humans due to being a Holocaust survivor. Obviously, we still have one more fighter to mention, bringing the total roster count up to 13. The game includes one final secret boss, Akuma from the iconic Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, who, as you all know, debuted in that game as a secret boss as well. Akuma's inclusion was pretty exciting and would later help lead to the X-Men vs Street Fighter title. One thing about this though, which I must mention because I've always found it quite amusing, is Akuma's sprite. Rather than making a new one, the team just copy and pasted the one from Street Fighter 2 over to this game, making him look rather out of place. This slapdash trend would continue into future games though. For example, with characters like Morrigan still having a 1994 Darkstalker sprite in games like Capcom vs SNK 2, an incredible 8 years later. In terms of the gameplay that can be found in this X-Men one, the game shares many tropes in common with other Capcom fighters of the period. For example, contests are settled in 2 out of 3 rounds to decide a winner. The game also features a mechanic extremely similar to the gauges found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Darkstalkers, published earlier that same year, that fill up as players perform both regular and special moves. In this game's case, this function is known as the X power gauge. These meters start at level 1 but reach level 2 when they are half filled. When this is achieved, auras surround fighters, but more techniques can be utilised when the gauge is filled to its maximum level. These meters can be depleted in a number of ways. First, players can perform an X ability which consumes a small portion of X power gauge, or a Hyper X which consumes a greater portion of gauge. Meter consumption is also used when breaking one's fall from a throw or performing a counter throw. The biggest innovation this title features that was not included in its sister Capcom fighting games that year was the fact that the combo system featured long combos that could even be performed mid-air. This would mean characters could fight it out in pioneering multi-tiered environments, in which in some cases the ground crumbles and the characters fall into lower parts of a stage. This fast-paced aerial combat would be a key ingredient that would be used as part of the identity of the entire Marvel vs. Capcom series, and would be one of the main mechanics that made the game stand apart from others. Via Polygon, Katsuya Akimoto added in the past that Children of the Atom was obviously about controlling the madness, and if you have a theme of controlling madness, the result will be something that looks wild, right? Nishitani and Yasuda, I think, were big proponents of this idea of controlling the madness, and I think that became a very prevalent theme in the game. I felt that the more flashy the game was, the more fun it would be, and I think that's what every team member felt as well. I mean, maybe we did too much with the game, maybe went too far, but we didn't really know that or feel that at the time. In this game, there was also more subtle elements included, such as various tactical maneuvers. For example, characters had the ability to roll, something characters could not yet do in Street Fighter until the release of Street Fighter Alpha the following year. The game had plenty of features to set it apart. This included giving the players the ability to perform super jumps and roll maneuvers. These could be used to roll away or towards an opponent after falling. Projectile moves could now also be used differently than in other Capcom games. Now players could aim them. The game would also present two systems where gamers could choose between a manual or automatic blocking system. The arcade game impressed many, and like all successes in that realm from the time period, it would of course only be a matter of time until the game would arrive on home formats, albeit with a vast amount of challenge to actually make this possible. This game was just so freaking impressive, so getting this one home was quite problematic. The plan was originally to put the game on the three most powerful game consoles on the market, the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation and the 3DO. An issue that Capcom faced though was that the game used 32 megabytes worth of character data alone, and the consoles on the market at the time offered a maximum of 2 megabytes of RAM in total. With it quickly becoming clear that the 3DO was a doomed system, it would not be long before that version of the game was cancelled altogether, thus meaning Capcom would only have the PlayStation and Saturn to worry about. During the development of the two versions of the game, Capcom would end up giving up on the PlayStation conversion too, as the system's limitations were making work very difficult. This just left the company with the Sega Saturn one to work with, and since the game was released in the pre-expansion cartridge days, even the Saturn port would need to have a third of its arcade animation frames removed from the character's movements. In regards to the Saturn version of the game, the Japanese and Western versions of the title differ, in that if you own a Japanese copy of the title, a cheat code allows players to play as the Juggernaut in the two-player versus mode. This feature was removed from international releases, with Capcom stating it was only in the Japanese version due to it being left in by mistake. Despite fewer animation frames as an early Saturn release, the Sega Saturn game was very well received. GamePro would state the game was converted perfectly to the Saturn and applauded the accessible controls, fast gameplay, colourful graphics and lack of slowdown. Sega Saturn magazine also would go on to declare the conversion as arcade perfect, aside from a few barely noticeable missed animation frames, commenting that for the first time comic book superheroes have been successfully translated to game format. Next Generation, on the other hand, was less impressed with the game, complaining that 2D fighting games had been done to death, writing fighting games off as a mere fad that they predicted would soon go away. Despite their scorn for the apparently dated fighting game genre, they did admit that Children of the Atom on the Saturn had smooth animation, brightly coloured graphics, and a good balance of characters, strengths and weaknesses. Maximum would also give the game a strong review, praising the conversion and complimenting the inclusion of a new survival mode. As mentioned earlier, Capcom gave up early on trying to convert the game to run on the Sony PlayStation, but in a not so shocking twist, the game's greedy publisher, Acclaim, desperately wanted to make more money off of the title, whether producing a PlayStation version would be a good game or not. Taking advantage of the PlayStation's massive user base, Acclaim would contract the converting out to Probe Entertainment, who would also be tasked with developing a PC version of Children of the Atom. Due to the porting to the basic hardware being so difficult, Children of the Atom would not arrive on the PlayStation until 1998, 4 years after the game's arcade release. The at that point dated game would of course be critically panned. Next Generation stated that, overall, if you crave 2D fighting fare, you could do worse than this game, but you can also do much better. What X-Men Children of the Atom mostly proves is that companies should learn to stop projects before they spiral past the time when they're relevant. IGN would not even dignify the game with a proper review, summarising, we're not going to waste too much time on this game. The character animation bites, the loading time is horrible, what more do you need? Children of the Atom would have been a 16-bit phenomenon in older times, but in our day and age, however, Children of the Atom bombs. Game Informer would also add, if this game had been released a couple of years ago, we could forgive it for its shortcomings, but by today's standards, Children of the Atom needs to be more refined. Play the Saturn version, it's much better. Overall, when it comes to home formats, X-Men Children of the Atom reflects the usual narrative of 2D fighting games being pretty good on the Sega Saturn, but pretty terrible on the PlayStation in comparison. We have heard this story many times before, and with this game, it is no different. Despite the poor conversion and one of the most popular pieces of hardware of all time, this X-Men title's influence is undeniable, and it contributed to shaping the future of fighting games in many ways going forward. Dana Mooreshead, who was head of creative services at Marvel Entertainment during Children of the Atom's release, reflects back on the game, stating, "We couldn't have planned it any better if we tried. It was a huge seller. It's when the X-Men animated series had come on the air, so it was a huge, it exceeded everybody's expectations." Alex Jimenez praises the significance of Children of the Atom, stating, "Capcom banked on the popularity of X-Men. They took a bit of a gamble. I've got to give them credit for that. Children of the Atom was their first hero licensed game with Marvel, and it paid off extremely well. Children of the Atom was a very, very popular game. Very successful title. Not only did this title strengthen the working relationship between Marvel and Capcom, but we of course saw a Street Fighter character appear alongside the X-Men for the first time, which would spark the thought track for the full X-Men vs Street Fighter title, and all the games that would come after it. That's without even mentioning the Capcom tier stage fighting and air combat that makes the superhero fighting game so innovative, and so important as a building block to what would come after it. Due to all of this, you really should respect this game. X-Men Children of the Atom was a humongous success. Both Capcom and Marvel were hungry to churn out more titles that would build on this fighting formula. After all, Capcom had continued to refine Street Fighter 2 with revision after revision, so why not build on what Children of the Atom brought to the table as well? In fact, when first signed on the dotted line to produce Children of the Atom, Capcom also signed deals with Marvel to produce the Super Nintendo game known as X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, and even more pertinent to today's episode, a second Marvel fighting game. This meant that even before Children of the Atom had been released, Capcom already had a group of artists, planners and developers working in parallel on what would become Marvel superheroes. This meant that this second superhero fighter had the potential to be released very shortly after its X-Men based counterpart. In an interview with Polygon, Takeshi Tezuka, a planner who worked on both of these games, states, "You could say that we made Marvel Superheroes as a sequel to Children of the Atom, in the same way Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition was a sequel to Street Fighter 2. But Children of the Atom only used X-Men characters, and Marvel had more popular characters from the Marvel universe at the time, such as Spider-Man and Iron Man. So when we were making them, we figured they'd be viewed as different games. It's sort of like, as the creators internally, we saw Marvel as a sequel, but as a commercial product, we wanted to present it as its own distinct game. Alex Jimenez, who worked on design support for Children of the Atom, adds that he believes that this was a smooth move, as everyone was expecting a literal updated X-Men fighting game, but instead the public got what at least looked like a whole different game. Marvel Superheroes would be directed by Takeshi Tezuka. This was the first time he took the director's seat, with his biggest accolade prior at Capcom seeing him function as one of the planners for the epic arcade beat-em-up known as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. In a space of less than 1 year, Capcom were able to deliver the follow-up to X-Men Children of the Atom in arcades with the release of Marvel Superheroes on October the 24th, 1995. Like its predecessor, this game too would take advantage of the Capcom System 2 arcade board. This new Japanese-produced fighter was dedicated to Marvel artist Jack Kirby, who had sadly died 1 year prior to the release of this game. The game embodied the typical Capcom style of its era, notably building upon the mechanics introduced in Children of the Atom. Capcom presented a title where players could choose from a wide array of superheroes and villains from the Marvel Universe for epic face-offs. Following the trend set by other titles based on the Street Fighter II formula, it continued to leverage the mechanics initially established in Children of the Atom, with aerial combos being a hallmark feature of Marvel Capcom games. As a crossover game featuring characters from the Marvel Universe, it naturally drew on the roster of the existing X-Men fighting game. This lineup included iconic characters such as Wolverine, Juggernaut, Magneto and Psylocke. Characters whom, according to Capcom's research, they would indicate were particularly popular in Western markets. In terms of gameplay, the most distinctive feature of this title, compared to the preceding X-Men game, was its implementation of the Infinity Gem system. The very same Infinity Gems which also appeared in the blockbuster Infinity Wars movie over a decade later. On the subject of these, they actually originated in a Marvel comic book as far back as 1972, 46 years before their mainstream adaptation in a Disney film. The now legendary gems made their first appearance in Marvel Premiere Issue 1, part of an American comic book anthology series published by Marvel. This series served as a testing ground for new characters and their accompanying stories, with the intention of gauging readers' interest. Essentially, Marvel Premiere was a platform for pilot concepts, where if an issue attracted enough readers, it could pave the way for these new stories and characters to launch their own series. The debut issue of Marvel Premiere prominently featured a character initially known as him, or Adam, but who had first appeared even earlier in 1967 within the pages of Fantastic Four. While his initial appearances were relatively minor, Marvel Premiere Issue 1 revitalised him as the allegorical messiah Adam Warlock in a starring role. The High Evolutionary was the mastermind behind the creation of Counter-Earth, initially intended as a purer rendition of the original Earth. However, Counter-Earth, much like its counterpart, quickly succumbed to the presence of villains and criminals, with the nefarious man-beast wreaking havoc. One striking disparity that set this world apart from Marvel's main Earth was the absence of superheroes. In response, the High Evolutionary dispatched Warlock to this realm to restore order. Counter-Earth was forged using the power of the Infinity Stones, and Warlock was entrusted with the Green Soul Gem to defend this realm against the Man-Beast. The Green Soul Gem grants its wielder the extraordinary ability to manipulate reality, specifically enabling them to influence the souls of beings throughout the universe, whether living or deceased. The second Soul Gem made its debut 3 years later in 1975 within the pages of a Captain Marvel story. This revelation marked the first occasion when it became apparent that there were indeed 6 distinct Soul Gems, each endowed with unique powers. Further insight into 2 of these gems emerged in 1977 during a crossover event involving Warlock and Spider-Man, and later that same year, all 6 gems made a collective appearance in a comic book storyline where the death-obsessed Thanos attempted to harness their power to extinguish every star in the universe. Thanos had initially appeared a few years earlier, in 1973, in an issue of Iron Man, but he would go on to be reintroduced as both an ally and adversary of Warlock in a narrative known as the Second Thanos War, which spanned until 1977. Following numerous appearances in Marvel Comics, in 1991 the storyline of Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet took centre stage in a 6-issue limited series of crossover chapters in related comics. This tale revolved around Thanos, who resolved to repossess the 6 Infinity Gems he had once employed as a mere weapon. After vanquishing the elders of the universe and regaining the stones, he acquired dominion over the 6 fundamental aspects of existence: time, space, mind, soul, reality, and power. Throughout the narrative, the Silver Surfer Adam Warlock and the Avengers embark on a mission to thwart the villain, leading to a series of intricate plot twists. Returning to the world of Marvel superheroes and its unique game mechanics, all the Infinity Gems make an appearance within the game. Players can obtain these gems from their opponents during a standard arcade playthrough, or by fulfilling specific requirements in versus mode, such as landing the first hit in a match. When a player utilises one of these gems during combat, they receive temporary enhanced effects. These benefits encompass various advantages, including health recovery, additional attacks, and the ability to boost the player's offensive or defensive capabilities. Additionally, it's worth noting that certain fighters in the game enjoy unique benefits. For instance, Spider-Man has the ability to conjure doppelgangers on the opposing side of his adversaries, enhancing the damage inflicted during attacks. Now, in terms of the game's roster, we've previously mentioned the inclusion of Spider-Man, Iron Man, and 4 of the X-Men. However, the game features several other fighters, as evident throughout this video. These encompass the likes of the iconic symbol of patriotism, Captain America, and the uncontrollable rage of the Incredible Hulk. Alongside these heroes, the game also boasts a fair share of villains from the vast Marvel universe, including Blackheart, Doctor Doom, and Shuma Gorath. The result is a notably diverse and intriguing roster. In addition to the 10 selectable characters featured on the character select screen, the game culminates in a final boss encounter with none other than the wielder of the all-powerful Infinity Gauntlet, the formidable Thanos. Thanos possesses every soul gem, making him an imposing opponent to contend with, and a fun little last challenge. Moreover, beyond the characters we've already discussed, the game harbours a surprising secret character in its Japanese version, Anita from Capcom's Darkstalker series. Notably, while Anita appeared in the Darkstalker games as the young girl protected by Donovan, Marvel Superhero stands as the sole video game where players can control Anita. In this game, she wields Donovan's sword through psychic means with a distinctive red ribbon attached to its handle. Besides its arcade presence, the game found its way to home consoles with announcements at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 1996, with even Stan Lee himself making an appearance at the event. Here, Marvel Superheroes was confirmed to release on both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. In terms of reception, the arcade version was generally well received, with computer and video games for instance awarding the title a perfect 5 out of 5 stars. Next Generation commended the game for its blend of combo-powered attacks and fluid animation, positioning it favourably amongst the best fighters. They also lauded the character selection and the exquisite sprite work, a rarity in the gaming landscape where polygon-based titles were becoming more prevalent. For fans of 2D fighting games, it's no surprise that the Sega Saturn conversion was nothing short of fantastic. The game garnered widespread praise for its offerings, supported by a RAM expansion cartridge that facilitated extra frames of animation and quicker load times compared to its PlayStation counterpart. A nice little bit of technology that didn't exist yet in the days of Children of the Atom. GamePro described it as an excellent port of the arcade game that had gamers feeding quarters into machines just the previous year. Sega Saturn magazine applauded the Saturn version for faithfully retaining all of the scenic effects of the arcade original, and declared that Marvel Superheroes makes 2D graphics cool again. As is customary, critics typically viewed the PlayStation version of the game as inferior to the Saturn version, attributing this to the perception that the Sony PlayStation was less adept at delivering 2D gaming excellence. GamePro even used the game as proof that the PlayStation couldn't match the Saturn's 2D capabilities, summarising, although it's identical to the Saturn version in features, the PlayStation game loses serious points for its unplayability. Ouch. Regardless of which version of the game you play, Marvel Superheroes remains a commendable fighting game and a significant milestone leading to the eventual release of multiple Marvel vs. Capcom games. This marked Capcom's inaugural foray into crossover games spanning various franchises. Moreover, this game delves into the saga of the Infinity Gauntlet, 2 decades before it became a cinematic blockbuster. Marvel Superheroes celebrated this iconic narrative long before it captivated global audiences. The game pays tribute to some of Marvel's most beloved superheroes in a flawless fusion of the fighting game genre, all during a time when these characters had yet to gain the same level of widespread mainstream popularity that they enjoy today. It's heartwarming to witness such dedication and craftsmanship poured into a game centred on the Infinity War, long before the average consumer even knew what it entailed. Despite achieving all of these firsts, Marvel Superheroes is a less revisited fighting game than most from the Marvel vs. Capcom fighting game lineage, which raises the question, why? Well, I guess it wasn't the first game of this style, such as X-Men Children of the Atom for example, and the fact that it was sandwiched between that game and the even more epic X-Men vs Street Fighter probably didn't help. This information is not only applicable to how we look at the game today, but also how we looked at it at the time the game showed up on the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. You see, by that point not only had X-Men vs Street Fighter been available in arcades for a year, but to make matters worse, X-Men vs Street Fighter arrived on the Saturn months before the Marvel Superheroes game did. If that's not enough reason to overlook a game, I don't know what is. Pair all this with the fact that all the characters would show up in later, more refined Capcom crossover games anyway, perhaps this serves as key reasoning as to why the game isn't so celebrated today as some of the others. Calling it the black sheep may be a little harsh, considering that it does very similar things to all of the other games of this style. Some of the others though were a little more exciting in my opinion. Despite these nitpicks, there is no denying that it introduced many important firsts to the world of gaming, for this reason it should be celebrated. Like with many games discussing fighting game history, a great starting point is always with the release of Street Fighter 2, the game credited for rejuvenating the arcade market, in a period where people spent most of their gaming time on consoles at home. With Street Fighter 2's success, Capcom decided they wanted to milk the game for all it was worth, which would soon lead to countless revisions, with each iteration being arguably more polished than the last. Despite relying on this formula for at least a few years, Capcom knew that to captivate the Street Fighter audience, sooner or later the fans would need something new, which would eventually lead to the arcade release of Street Fighter Alpha in 1995. But for reasons, this was not enough for Capcom, as over the next 12 months following the birth of Alpha, the arcades would bloody see the release of another 4 fighting games featuring the Street Fighter license. 1996 to 1997 would be a hectic period for the franchise, as it would see the debut of Street Fighter Alpha 2, Street Fighter 3, Street Fighter EX, and the subject of today's video, X-Men vs Street Fighter. That is a freaking lot of Street Fighters for such a short time frame, right? This makes it no surprise that the casual audience severely struggled to keep up and stay interested in the standard Street Fighter brand, as there was more games than any casual cared to keep up with. So, for most people, out of the games released in this era, X-Men vs Street Fighter was certainly the most interesting of the bunch, with myself being one of the individuals who was thoroughly fascinated by this concept, as pairing up the X-Men and Street Fighter together seemed like such a strange yet perfect idea. On the X-Men side of things, the superheroes are in a very different place in 1996 to their standing today. Originally debuting in 1963 as a comic book series by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, by the time we got to the 90s the franchise had entered all sorts of entertainment mediums. A focal point in the expansion of the brand occurred on the 12th of February 1992. The day an awesome X-Men beat-em-up was released into the arcade by Konami. Apparently, the character designs in this one will be based on the 1989 X-Men cartoon pilot episode, known as Pride of the X-Men, and this high-quality experience is remembered extremely fondly today as the first ever top-tier X-Men video game. I mean, come on, it was 6-player for crying out loud. Later that very year, an X-Men animated series would debut on the Fox Kids network and become equally critically acclaimed, and more importantly, a huge commercial success. As a result, this would spawn another 4 seasons of the show, more comic books, action figures, and of course even more video games. We have now looked at loads of these on the channel already, but unfortunately most from this period weren't great, due to Acclaim holding the licensing rights to publish most X-Men games. You know, that greedy company who would often churn out utter rubbish under the LJN brand. Sadly, there were no Konami X-Men games that could be enjoyed in the homes. Fortunately, through this era of bad to mediocre Marvel games, at some point Capcom would manage to strike up a licensing deal with the company, first working on the Punisher arcade game. The Punisher would deliver brilliance, instilling enough confidence in Marvel to work with Capcom further. Moving on to the next Capcom Marvel project, we would get the 1994 title, X-Men Children of the Atom. This was initially released on the Capcom CP System 2 arcade hardware, before being released on several home platforms too. The fighting game features controls and conventions that Capcom previously established within Street Fighter 2 and Darkstalkers, but would include one key, massive innovation: the introduction of superhero-like air combat. As expected, this would result in a chaotic, exciting fighting game indeed, but the title would also include one more feature, functioning as a cherry on top. Basically, part of a licensing agreement struck by Capcom allowed them to place Akuma as a secret character within the game. This fighter, who was inspired by the legend of Shen Long, was appearing in multiple Street Fighter games as a secret, unlockable playable character and opponent. Inserting him straight into the X-Men universe would be even more magical, a beat the ridiculously out of place looking Street Fighter 2 sprite. This would of course mark the first time in which characters from X-Men and Street Fighter would face off against each other, but as we know, it would be far from the last time. The following year of 1995 would see the next Capcom Marvel game, a video game simply titled Marvel Superheroes. This would be a similar fighting game, with it this time featuring a whole range of characters from across the Marvel universe, as opposed to just X-Men. The game included needing to collect Infinity Gems from your opponents, with a final boss encounter against Thanos. But it would be the next Capcom Marvel fighting game where things got really interesting, so let's watch the game's arcade attract screen.
X-Men vs. Street Fighter!
How could you possibly have watched that in 1996 without getting extremely excited to play this one? This title was insane. The epic opening scene touts itself as the wildest crossover you have ever dreamt of, which would be perfectly applicable if you hadn't already been dreaming about it 2 years after playing Children of the Atom. For those who have experienced this now classic game for the Capcom CP System 2 hardware, this title's player select screen gives gamers a choice of 16 different playable characters, either from the world of X-Men or of course Street Fighter. Most of the Street Fighter sprites are taken straight from the Alpha series, whereas the X-Men were mostly taken from Children of the Atom. The freshly drawn playable characters for this one include Rogue, Sabretooth and Gambit, since they were never featured in any Capcom games prior. Oh yeah, and the Cammy sprite is new too, but she also appeared in Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold around the same time. Once again, regarding the characters, Akuma also returns as a secret character within the game, a fun little recurring trope. On top of that, the rest of the cast, the game also features a final boss battle against Apocalypse, which is a nice change of pace from many Capcom fighters of the time. Bearing in mind he is not a regular fighter and instead is massive and takes up the majority of the screen. He is more like certain boss encounters in a Mega Man X game or something. Like Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha and Capcom's previous Marvel games, this one was obviously yet another 2D fighting game. But the game varies from all of its predecessors due to it featuring dual character selection and tag team matches. Players, holla holla holla. The game further differs from many fighters in that the best of 3 rounds format is completely ditched, and instead the fighting in this entry consists of just single rounds. Going back to that lovely player select screen I mentioned earlier, the player must choose 2 of these players prior to a playthrough. As a result, the starting character can tag in and out of a fight with their off-screen character at will, changing the dynamic of this one completely when compared with previous Capcom offerings beyond the super cool crossover format. Regarding this mechanic, both controllable characters sport independent life gauges, and the dormant off-screen character will even regenerate HP when not in battle. If one of your characters is knocked out, the other jumps straight into play, letting the match continue until a team is defeated. All in all, making this Teddy Long's all-time favourite fighting game. All that was missing was going one-on-one with The Undertaker, but at least we had Apocalypse. Other mechanics also returned from previous Capcom Marvel games, including the amazing air combat first established in Children of the Atom. Through this, fighters can perform super jumps, allowing them to jump higher than normal and perform aerial raves, which enable combos in the air. Excellent. Regarding some of the big moves in this game, many are quite frankly ridiculous and are very fitting of the X-Men. When it comes to the Street Fighters on the other hand, certain maneuvers did look a bit out of place. For example, Ryu can suddenly perform a massive Kamehameha beam, instead of just a simple Hadouken. But then again, without such maneuvers, how else would these lot compete with Marvel characters, I guess? After hitting arcades in Japan in late 1996, the game would go into circulation worldwide shortly after. According to Electronic Gaming Monthly, surprisingly the game was only mildly popular when first released on US soil, but after a few months it reportedly began to pick up some steam due to word of mouth spreading regarding this one's coolness. Regarding how journalists responded to this title at the time, opinions were mixed, with the main consensus being that the game was a decent fighter, but just one of many to exist. Next Generation, for example, praised the new tag team mechanic, inflated projectile attacks and lengthy combos. However, they took note of how much Capcom were milking the fighting game formula. So they concluded, X-Men vs Street Fighter is a fun game, but it's a bit of an overdose of the kind of game of which we've already played way too much. Despite these ramblings of negativity from journalists, the arcade version is very clearly fondly remembered today, with, for me and many, the main drawing factor being the novelty of having Street Fighters and the X-Men characters in the same bloody game. Then again, the tag action was certainly something fresh and bombastic too, especially when we take into account that all of this occurred in an era where corporate crossovers seemed to happen far more infrequently. We still had no Smash Brothers yet, for example. Touching back on this game's gameplay, originally each character had at least one infinite combo, which was not actually an intended feature. The game-breaking ability to perform such crazy feats ended up existing in the original iteration of the game due to insufficient beta testing. As a result, Capcom would quietly tinker with X-Men vs Street Fighter, resulting in two updated versions, colloquially known as version 2 and version 3. The main change in version 2 of the game is that it removed Ryu and Akuma's ability to recover from their hop kicks in midair. Version 2 also changed Ryu's Hurricane super move to move the player up instead of down. Finally, Sabretooth and Dao Sim's mechanics were altered as well. Version 3 of the game would see a more extensive overhaul though, resulting in Capcom removing all of the infinite combos that they knew of. Around this era of fighting game history, there were infamously no way to port Street Fighter 3 New Generation to home consoles, due to no home machines being available on the market in 1997 that could handle the extreme amount of 2D animation frames that were present in the game. This meant that for now at least the game was imprisoned on Capcom's technologically advanced Capcom CP System 3 arcade hardware. But fortunately for X-Men vs Street Fighter, the game wasn't quite as taxing. As already covered, this was a CP System 2 game which featured many assets that were simply recycled from Children of the Atom and Street Fighter Alpha 2, two games that had already been wonderfully ported to the Sega Saturn already. Keeping such thoughts in mind, on the 6th of November 1996 at a press conference, Capcom announced that the home version of X-Men vs Street Fighter would be a Sega Saturn exclusive. Now, when we consider that the Sega Saturn was never a particularly popular console outside of Japan, this would of course result in outrage, particularly amongst those who had become Sony PlayStation loyalists. The backlash from this announcement led to both the gaming press and fans alike accusing Capcom of demonstrating favouritism towards Sega, essentially making accusations that Sega and Capcom were colluding with each other to ensure that the Saturn had games that the PlayStation didn't. This conspiracy theory was further bolstered by the fact that Darkstalkers Revenge was also a Saturn exclusive, and that Street Fighter Alpha 2 did not run as well on the PlayStation as it did the Sega Saturn. Gaming historians though will now easily be able to point to the reality that Street Fighter Alpha 2 ran better on the Saturn simply due to the Saturn being engineered better when it came to handling sprite-based games. The RAM cartridges that could be inserted into the top of the devices only improved the Saturn's capabilities in such an area too. Retrospectively, rather obviously, the earlier decision to make X-Men vs Street Fighter a Saturn home exclusive had nothing to do with favouritism, and was simply related to the Sega Saturn's 2D capabilities. The Saturn was a superior system to the PlayStation in that regard, as it offered 50% more video memory, which in turn meant that the system could produce bigger and better sprites, along with superior looking backgrounds. For Saturn's 2 video processors could handle 2D beautifully, and that is even without the RAM cartridges. So all this meant that the Saturn would be the perfect home hardware for X-Men vs Street Fighter, a game which was more demanding to run than the Alpha series due to its tag team matches. So all in all, the decision to make the game a Saturn exclusive seemed like a very sensible choice. Unfortunately, a big stumbling block with this plan was coming to light, as during development the popularity of the Sega Saturn in the West continued to diminish, with the Sony PlayStation outpacing it more and more sales-wise every day. The Sony PlayStation's superior marketing, cheaper price point and heavy emphasis on polygon gaming made the hardware the average gamer's choice that generation. So with pressure continuing to mount from Capcom's Western fanbase, Capcom were backed into a corner and would be forced to rescind the idea of X-Men vs Street Fighter being a Saturn exclusive. For now at least, fans were no longer outraged. As this was unfolding before our eyes, Electronic Gaming Monthly reported that Capcom had announced that instead of making the game a Sega exclusive, the game would have PlayStation and Saturn versions of X-Men vs Street Fighter, with both being released simultaneously and both being arcade perfect. A bold claim indeed, which certainly couldn't go wrong, right? 14 months on from the game's arcade release, X-Men vs Street Fighter would arrive on the Saturn in November of 1997, but sadly, exclusively in Japan, with the PlayStation version nowhere to be seen. The game would be released to rave reviews and see a critical response even stronger than the original arcade release. This conversion of the game would be heavily praised for its fast-paced gameplay, great animations, sound quality, and technical performance compared to its arcade counterpart. GameSpot was in love with the game and stated that there is no better looking 2D fighter on any console system. Game Informer added to the praise of the port for running and looking identical to its arcade counterpart, and declaring it one of the best arcade conversions ever seen to date. Next Generation 2 highly regarded this version, stating that, if nothing else, X-Men vs Street Fighter proved the old adage, more is better. The game ran arcade perfect on Saturn hardware, which was made possible due to the system's 2D capabilities paired with the adage of the Capcom 4MB RAM cartridge that came with the game. The Capcom cartridge was a system expansion cart that preceded the 1MB RAM cartridge that had been released by SNK earlier for the system. This extra memory would assist the game's ability to run properly and prevent problems such as slowdown from happening. When you consider the existence of this expansion cartridge, it becomes even clearer why at one point Capcom wanted to release this game exclusively for the Saturn. Speaking of the Saturn version, sadly it would remain exclusive to Japan due to Sega's continuous reduction of support for the system in North America and Europe due to a lack of hardware and software sales. This, however, did not stop Western game stores such as Electronic Boutique from importing the game from Japan and selling it to consumers regardless. The Sega Saturn remains a popular system with importers up until today, and games like X-Men vs Street Fighter encouraged this trend in behaviour. So now we have talked about the Saturn version of the game, we need to move on to talk about the Sony PlayStation version. And this is where things begin to get really juicy, or should I say, outrageous. Remember that arcade perfect PlayStation version of the game which Capcom promised to release the same day as the Saturn game? Well, that didn't happen, which should have sent alarm bells ringing instantly. Despite delays, the game would eventually be released on the PlayStation in Japan, but not until February 1998. This was 4 months after the Saturn version. It would not get to America till June and Europe and Australia until the winter. Staggered regional releases were nothing out of the ordinary at the time, but the fact that the PlayStation version was left cooking for longer raised a lot of questions, particularly when we take into account that originally Capcom didn't want to make a PlayStation version at all. After buckling to pressure and releasing a PlayStation version of X-Men vs Street Fighter, the game would not be the arcade perfect conversion that the company had once promised, as those with technical know-how had already foreseen.
They won't remember.
The PlayStation port of the game was vastly inferior to its Saturn counterpart. The system's memory limitations and other 2D weaknesses required X-Men vs Street Fighter to be massively scaled down and altered in both the areas of gameplay and graphics. This would include Capcom needing to remove several character animation frames from the game to get the game to run on puny PlayStation hardware. Whilst all of this was key to getting the game working on the device, the most notable and shocking omission from this version was the removal of tag team combat, a staple of the game, and a mechanic that was one of the biggest features that had made the game stand out from the pack. In this watered down iteration, the second character is only used during specific attacks, such as the variable combinations. The ability to switch between characters at will is completely gone. To compensate for this tag change, 1-round battles are changed to the regular 2 out of 3 full encounters found in most other generic fighting games from the period. Interestingly, as a compensatory offering, a stage match can still be experienced in the game, however only using a cheat code. I say only a sort of tag match because to make this possible, both you and your opponent have to play as the same 2 characters due to the PlayStation's lack of ability to keep 4 different character animations in its working memory simultaneously. The Gimped PlayStation version of X-Men vs Street Fighter would result in some absolutely hilarious reviews at the time, with many journalists completely chastising this version of the game. The game that people were outraged about not being made was now causing outrage due to being made. Sometimes there's no pleasing people. Next Generation, for example, who we have touched on several times in this video, stated, "If you've never seen a Capcom fighting game before, this might be fun for a few minutes. But there is not one single positive thing to be said for the trade-offs that Capcom made to get this game to the PlayStation." Ouch. Game Revolution adds to this version's criticism by stating, "The game is a poor conversion of its arcade counterpart. The graphics aren't going to impress anyone either. If you're looking for a game that is a better arcade translation, check out Tekken 3, or wait for Street Fighter vs Care Bears, due out later this year." My favourite of these angry reviews came from GameSpot, which is hilarious to read throughout. The opening paragraph of this review features a level of salt that is so intense that it had me chuckling upon digesting every sentence. The opening paragraph reads, "When a system is incapable of doing justice to a game, one would think a company would be smart enough to not release the game on that system. But for reasons that are probably based entirely around making money, Capcom has released a completely butchered version of its arcade fighter, X-Men vs Street Fighter, on the PlayStation." Amongst this scathing review, they also state that the graphics look very washed out and there is a completely unacceptable amount of slowdown. Ken's Ryuken Super Combo had most of the frames chopped out, and it still slows the game down to a crawl. The slowdown and missing frames are so bad and so noticeable that they have a detrimental effect on the already bad gameplay. The ruthless review closes with, "At some point in the development cycle, someone should have stepped in, seen that the PlayStation simply couldn't do justice to the original game, and pulled the plug. I like the Street Fighter series as much as the next guy, but this is taking it way too far." The brown icing on the turd cake in this story was this was the only home version of the game available to play in the West at the time, unless you purchased an import copy. With the PlayStation game being so different to its Saturn counterpart over in Japan, they didn't even try to claim that these 2 titles were the same game, and instead the PlayStation title would be sold as X-Men vs Street Fighter EX Edition. Now, going back to my personal opinion on this whole matter, I believe that as gimped as this game is compared to its Saturn and arcade counterparts, it is not anywhere near as bad as some of these reviewers make it out. It still offers the novelty of being able to play as the X-Men and the cast of Street Fighter in the same game, which is all that half the casual market would have wanted from this anyway. So it offered something no other home game in the Western market did. Some may not have been aware of how different this game was from its arcade and Saturn brothers. In all of this anger that seemed to be directed towards Capcom in these reviews, you could argue that the reviewers should have been angry with the PlayStation user base instead, who chose to back the system with their wallets that performed so poorly at handling 2D games in the first place. Yuck! From Capcom's perspective, their hands were clearly a bit tied in this situation, as the PlayStation essentially was the only system worth making games for in the West during the game's release window, which was a crying shame considering how imperfect it was as a console. They entered this situation very reluctantly and were answering consumer demand to the best that they could with the hardware they had at their disposal. All in all, it is very clear that if you want to experience X-Men vs Street Fighter at its best, the arcade or the Sega Saturn is the way to go. However, the PlayStation version is not the total garbage it is often made out to be. It's just not the same game as it was in the arcades. To summarise, the X-Men vs Street Fighter release story is interesting, full of controversy, criticism and even critical acclaim. The game has a legacy as polarising as any, as both astonishing and hilarious in equal measures to go back and explore. From all of this, you can see why both the audience and fans alike were outraged at different points through this game's story. The sequel to the Street Fighter X-Men crossover would arrive in Japanese arcades as quickly as July 1997, 10 months after Wolverine and company had graced us with their presence in a Capcom fighter previously. In order to be able to pump out another game of this flavour so quickly, it is very clear that Capcom used their previous crossover outing as a base and worked from there. So what would be the same and what would be different? As expected, Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter would once again be programmed to run off of the Capcom CP System 2 arcade hardware. And like with any profitable arcade game, a decent attract mode would be included in order to get gamers to part with their cash and insert their precious small round things into Capcom's alluring slot. So let's look at this game's introduction.
Are you ready, true believers? Capcom and Marvel have joined forces once again to bring you it's Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter! Survive uncanny adventure! Don't miss out on the enjoyment of a lifetime! Behold, amazing fantasy! Don't miss the most amazing tag team fighting game ever! Are you ready for a new challenger? Let's rock! Experience Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter! Welcome to the adventure!
To be fair, that entire sequence was pretty epic, offering up not only glimpses of comic book icons squaring off against Capcom's combatants, but the entire sequence is pushed over the edge by the absolutely wonderful announcer's voice. Maybe I need to hire that guy to tell people to subscribe to this channel. Welcome to the adventure. Hint hint. This utter vocal lunatic hangs around throughout, and beyond the game's delightfully flashy attract scenes, he is omnipresent on the character select screen too, playfully challenging gamers to choose their alter ego. Wonderful. Speaking of the character select screen, the roster differs quite significantly from the previous X-Men vs Street Fighter title. On the Street Fighter side of things, we once again have 9 characters from that franchise, with a further 8 representatives by Marvel. Some players at the time may have been disappointed that on the Street Fighter side not much has changed here, with only 2 fighters being switched out for others. Charlie and Cammy are out, and in their place are the comical Dan and the affable Sakura. The latter, in my opinion, being a particularly strong choice, as thematically she fits the game very well. Part of this character was after all influenced by the Japanese high school girl superhero archetype, utilised in the likes of Sailor Moon. Sakura is hugely popular in Japan, so having her do battle with and alongside Western superheroes could have only helped aid sales. The Japanese love schoolgirls. So Sakura was added to the mix for the sake of popularity, with Dan being included likely to add a semblance of comic relief. This overconfident, arrogant and utterly feeble character never fails to entertain me, and can always lighten the mood. The Marvel side though is where characters are really mixed up, as obviously the prior entry only had X-Men. In fact, only Cyclops and Wolverine make a return in this game, opening up the other roster spots to other Marvel heroes and villains. Joining the originals we have Captain America, the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man, some of the most iconic comic book characters ever. And joining them in the remaining roster spots we have Shuma Gorath, Blackheart and Omega Red, who I must say are some arguably questionable choices. So, why did Capcom do this, you may ask? Well, this is where accusations of laziness can be easily brought in. You see, when it comes to the roster of this fighting game, Capcom did not bother to create any new character sprites for either Marvel or Street Fighter characters. Instead, each of these was simply lifted and recycled from previous games. All the Street Fighter sprite work is taken from the Street Fighter Alpha series, and the Marvel character sprites are either from Capcom's previous Marvel Superheroes game or X-Men Children of the Atom. Those who had played the prior titles would be completely familiar with this base roster, which was a tad disappointing. Fortunately, the game does include some secret characters, but Capcom decided to lazily take a leaf out of Mortal Kombat's playbook by offering palette swaps of existing characters, but giving them different names. These include ridiculous oddities such as Armoured Spider-Man, Evil Sakura, Mech Zangief and more. My particular favourite of these is US Agent, as it sounds like the name you would see written on the packaging of an unlicensed Captain America costume, in an attempt to avoid infringement. Also, yes, I do know US Agent is an actual official Marvel character, but it still sounds super Chinese bootleg. So the roster in the arcade game is essentially just a mix of characters from pre-existing Capcom titles. But what about if we look past this? Does the rest of the game bring much freshness forward? Beyond the roster, we of course have the game's stages themselves. Sadly, it does not appear that any of these are new, but once again just old assets that have been slightly tweaked. From everything we have covered so far, it's actually quite difficult to look at Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter as even a standalone game, as a case can be made that it was just a newer version of X-Men vs Street Fighter, much in the same way that Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting was an upgraded Champion Edition. Speaking of things that are the same, you even do battle with Apocalypse again at the end of the playthrough. However, to be fair to the game, there is a cool twist which personally I think was very entertaining. Past Apocalypse, another opponent lays in wait, the infamous Cyber Akuma. Yes, he is basically just a Terminator wearing a pair of sandals, but he provides a tough challenge to gamers who are looking to defeat this Hadouken throwing maniac. Scary stuff. When it comes to an upgrade of a previous Capcom fighting game, a feature you would expect most from such a project would be some balancing and refinement to combat, with perhaps a few new mechanics trickled in here and there. In Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter's case, the notable addition to the gameplay is something known as variable assists. Using this new technique, the player can summon their off-screen character to perform a special attack without switching their currently controlled fighter out of play. This opens up a realm of new possible combos during matches, which further expand on the purpose of having a second character at your disposal. All in all, this improves on the tag team action, and as a result, this mechanic was continually carried over to further entries in the Versus series. So that's another massive positive in this one's favour. According to Seth Killian, a former Capcom USA community manager, commenting on this game previously, he stated that the primary goal with Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter was to tone down the insanity that occurred on screen when compared to in X-Men vs Street Fighter. Basically, what he meant by this was that the developers wanted to make the game more competitive and balanced. Now, X-Men vs Street Fighter is an extremely fun, chaotic game, but due to coding flaws and a lack of beta testing, gamers can pull off infinite combos. Many gamers were hugely entertained by this, but to make the affair more competitive, Capcom would ultimately release 3 different versions of the X-Men crossover in an attempt to remove this unintended feature. Capcom did try their best to remove all the known infinites, however, their efforts to remove all of them was ultimately futile. So what for Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter? Well, developers finally had the opportunity to rewrite what they perceived as wrongs, so would seek to create a fighter they deemed less broken. To be fair to Capcom, they were fairly successful in achieving this feat. However, quite amusingly, fan reception at the time was fairly negative with regards to these changes, as they looked at the game to be offering them less freedom than with the previous entry. Proof that sometimes games prefer something a little less sanitary and rougher around the edges. A case could be made that the chaotic nature of X-Men vs Street Fighter was one of the reasons that many fell in love with the game to begin with. So with the infinites gone, some felt a layer of charm had been removed. So this is what gamers would receive from the arcade game. But what about the home ports? It doesn't require a rocket scientist to hypothesize that since the game is so similar to X-Men vs Street Fighter, that porting the game to home platforms was a process that Capcom would know how to do. The problem was though that with the prior game there was a huge quality difference between the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation versions of the title. So bearing in mind the architectural differences the systems had, was the PlayStation's 2D performance destined to make history repeat itself? Let's take a look at what people thought. The first home version of this game would see a release in October of 1998 for the Sega Saturn. The Saturn by this point was essentially a dead duck in the West, so sadly this version was made exclusively for the Japanese market. This conversion was obviously very arcade accurate. After all, you have to remember that the Saturn port, like with X-Men vs Street Fighter, was supported by the 4MB RAM expansion peripheral. This allowed the developers to create a conversion which retained the original frame rates and tag team system, But what did the gaming media think of the game when we consider its strong similarities to what came before it? GameSpot's review of the Saturn title was a mixed bag. They stated graphically the game is very good, the sprites are extremely well animated, and the backgrounds are all packed with movement, giving the game a nice busy look. It's a perfect conversion of the arcade game, that much we know, but that doesn't really stop it from being a near carbon copy of X-Men vs Street Fighter. From here, GameSpot would go on to roast the future PlayStation edition of the game, stating it's pretty much a given that this version is going to easily smoke the PlayStation version. If you're still interested in the Saturn, then this game is definitely one to import. Digital Extremes gave the game a glowing review, summarising that the title is another arcade perfect 4MB translation from Capcom. Too bad it's probably going to be the last. If you're looking for a great Saturn fighter, give Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter a shot. German publication Video Games added to the Saturn game's praise by stating, the game gives the beat-em-up community another potential fun hit. As you would expect, you will be spoiled with excellent animated characters and backgrounds. Marvel vs Street Fighter is another Saturn jewel in the 2D fighting game genre. So looking at all of these reviews and looking at the conversion myself, it is easy to conclude that once again Capcom have managed to pull off the feat of getting this game to run fantastically on the Saturn, looking near arcade perfect as a result. So in most cases the gaming media were impressed once again. The only real drawback though was that they too noted that it was essentially just X-Men vs Street Fighter, with a different roster and a few tweaks, just as highlighted earlier in the video. But I have saved the best for you with the Saturn section of the story for last, with things getting a little crazy here. Essentially, there's one more character I thought we would save talking about until we reached this point. The all-new ridiculous playable character known as Norimaro. Sadly, due to licensing issues, this character can only be found in the Japanese versions of the game, with the Saturn version obviously being left in Japan due to the Saturn being essentially a dead system in the West. Norimaro can be found on every Saturn disc. The character is the creation of a Japanese comedian, Noritaki Kinashi, so as expected, Norimaro is placed in this zany game as a sort of comic relief character. I guess Dan just wasn't enough. Oh yeah, speaking of Dan, one of the versions of the game features Cyber Dan, which is absolutely epic. One final note worth mentioning in regard to the Saturn version of the title is that an additional mode of play had been added to the conversion. This extra bit of content is known as Survival Mode, which basically lets you square off against multiple opponents using just one life bar. Standard console release stuff. But what would be a Capcom vs Series retrospective video without discussing the Sony PlayStation? The PlayStation version of Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter would be reported on in October of 1998 by IGN, which was 4 months before this conversion would arrive on the system, not reaching the platform until February of 1999. IGN reported that Capcom were aiming to circumvent PlayStation's memory restrictions at least partially, due to the negative backlash that hampered the PlayStation version of X-Men vs Street Fighter previously. Upon the game's February 1999 PlayStation release, the game would feature 5 modes of play, known as Battle, Versus, Training, Hero Battle and Crossover Mode. Sadly though, once again Teddy Long was very disappointed, as the conversion was once again missing the tag team mechanic players, which was obviously due to the same reasons as before. Capcom were once again unable to overcome the issue of the Sony system not being able to hold 4 character animations in its working memory simultaneously. As for the notable modes, Hero Battle is a sort of endurance mode, where both yourself and your opponent pick a selection of fighters each, with the competitor who manages to KO the entirety of the opposing team being declared the winner. Nothing mind-blowing really, but it's something. GameSpot would describe crossover mode as follows. It allows you to pick 2 characters. Then the computer uses the same character you picked. This limits the amount of information the PlayStation has to handle to 2 characters instead of 4. If you are victorious in this battle, the computer swaps one of the characters each of you have for another. This is done so you aren't playing with and against the same 2 characters each fight. To put it simply, this mode is a kind of compensatory one for the traditional tag team action being missing. However, reviewers such as GameSpot were unimpressed by this, commenting, It gives you the tag team experience of the arcade, but having to deal with the rotating character thing and having to fight mirror images of yourself is extremely weak in comparison. Speaking of GameSpot, they were the entity who gave X-Men vs Street Fighter on the PlayStation an outrageous verbal bashing. Overall, however, this time around, they did not seem to hold quite as harsh an opinion, appearing slightly more balanced with the latter game. They wrote, "Visually, Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter looks good, but when you compare it with its arcade counterpart, it simply fails. The colours aren't nearly as vibrant, and the game suffers from quite a bit of slowdown. Street Fighter fans will definitely feel the typical Street Fighter gameplay, but in the end, it's all a question of how starved you are for another Street Fighter game." IGN added similar review feedback stating, "While there's no denying that Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter is a fast, fun and solid fighting game, it certainly isn't without flaws. The aforementioned lack of true tag team play is one that will seriously affect players who are used to the arcade version. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to those who didn't enjoy X-Men vs Street Fighter, or those who are looking for something truly innovative from their next fighting game." All in all, the three versions of this game all display a range of similarities in terms of both strengths and weaknesses, with the three versions that were released of X-Men vs Street Fighter previously. So, the story of the arcade game and its ports mirror one another, which isn't surprising at all considering this newer game is nothing more than a revision, well at least according to many. Given just how similar Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter is to X-Men vs Street Fighter, it isn't surprising that many people view this game as the black sheep of the Marvel vs Capcom family. Well, at least the black sheep until Marvel vs Capcom Infinite came along anyway, but that's a whole nother story. Perhaps consumers may have felt a little less misled if the publisher had have called this game X-Men vs Street Fighter Marvel Superheroes Edition or something, so that gamers had more of an idea of what sort of experience they were in for. But then again, would they have made as many sales if the title wasn't marketed as a separate game? Let me know what you think down below. Titling the game Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter certainly did make the most business sense in my opinion, but bearing in mind all of the recycled sprite work, stages and gameplay, it's not surprising at all that it rubbed many gamers the wrong way. Still, if you view this game through the lens of an upgrade, there is still a lot to love about it. A Street Fighter roster alongside Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk and Captain America for the first time, a legendary boss battle with Cyber Akuma, Cyber Dan, then we have rebalancing and fine-tuning for those who prefer their games to be more fair and competitive. And all of that is without mentioning the introduction of assists, which would play a part in every Marvel vs Capcom game going forward. I can see sensible reasons why some would consider this one a bit special, but at the same time I can also see why a lack of chaos and originality may have put a lot of people off, with those folks seeing this as no more than a cheeky cash grab. I, on the other hand, think it's probably both. What an evil fence-sitting centrist I am. I noted previously that there was only a 10-month gap between the release of X-Men vs Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, which is an incredibly small amount of time, even by cash-grabbing Capcom standards. But what you may find even more amusing is that there would be an even smaller window between Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter and Marvel vs Capcom, with this time there being a mere 6-month gap between entries, which is insane when you think about it. These crossovers were just some of the fighting games that Capcom were bringing out at the time as well, with Street Fighter Alpha 3, Street Fighter EX2 and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure all being examples of other Capcom published fighting games that saw release that year. All we seem to get from Capcom these days is a new Street Fighter game every 7 years or so it was clearly a very different time. So what did they do with Marvel vs Capcom to try and make it stand out from everything else they had on the market? Well, build on the crossover format of course. To expand on the crossover idea, since the previous game incorporated a roster of Street Fighter characters alongside fighters from the greater Marvel universe, the next logical step in the series was to expand the roster on the Capcom side of things. This meant that this new game would include characters from other Capcom games, rather than just relying on the presence of Street Fighters. So with all of this in mind, let's start breaking this one down, starting with checking out the arcade game's attract mode.
Capcom presents
Marvel vs. Capcom! Marvel vs. Capcom.
That's some pretty epic hype to be fair, but what else could be expected of this series? From the initial character select screen, you will notice that this game initially offers 15 different playable characters, including the return of several from the previous games in the series. In terms of Street Fighters, Ryu, Chun-Li and Zangief all return, while Wolverine, Spider-Man, Captain America and the Hulk are all back on the Marvel side. On top of this, Gambit also returns for the first time since X-Men vs Street Fighter, a welcome returnee when we consider how popular this character is. If you suckers can count, you may have noted that I just listed off 8 fighters, meaning the other 7 characters are all brand new additions to this crossover series, and all in all decent additions they are, so let us briefly touch on each of them. On the Marvel side of things, there are only 2 new fighters though, so let us start off by covering those. Firstly, we have War Machine from the Iron Man franchise, which may or may not be a palette swap of Iron Man from the Marvel superheroes fighting game. Secondly, a much more exciting character was introduced, fricking Venom, one of my all-time favourite Marvel characters. If you grew up in the 90s, you will probably be able to recall what a huge deal Venom was, with this villain becoming highly popular through the success of the Spider-Man animated series on the Fox Kids network. So, great choice there. When I first played this one as a youngster, Venom would instantly become one of my go-to choices as a result. But being another of Teddy Long's favourites, this game would feature tag team matches players, so I would get to select another fighter to team up with Venom. This brings me to my favourite Capcom addition to the game, Mega Man. In the words of Sheev Palpatine, this was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one, as I never expected to see him included in a game like this. You see, Mega Man always felt particularly special to me, as I was always the only person at school who liked or had even heard of these franchise. Growing up in the UK, the NES was never a particularly popular platform, so most people missed his games during the 8-bit era. However, for me personally, the Mega Man X games were some of the crown jewels in my childhood Super Nintendo collection. Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo didn't sell very well due to no brand recognition being built up in the region during Nintendo's 8-bit days. This meant that I felt like I was the only one in the world who loved the Mega Man, even though, from what I now know, he was massive in the United States and Japan. Seeing him amongst this star-studded lineup, I guess was really my first glimpse of what a big deal this character truly was. Being able to play as Venom and Mega Man against a cast of X-Men and Street Fighter characters felt like the craziest yet coolest concept for a game that had ever been conceived, and, retrospectively, I do not think I was wrong in my thinking either. To accompany Mega Man, we would also get the debut of Strider Hiryu from the Strider hack-and-slash platforming series, Jin Sayatomi from the Cyberbots series, Captain Commando from the 1991 side-scrolling beat-em-up, and of course Morrigan, who had built up a strong reputation and fan following through the awesome Darkstalkers series.
What the? She's a goddamn succubus!
Succubus trying to take my baby!
On top of the 15 initial playable characters, the game also features a number of secret characters, a number of which are palette swaps, such as Shadow Lady, who is a variant of Chun-Li, and Red Venom, who is a palette swap of Venom, a trope that was carried over from Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter. Roll is also present from the Mega Man series, who features the same moveset as Mega Man, however at least with this one she features her own unique sprite. Outside of the selectable characters though, there are actually even more in-game characters to talk about, however we shall get to the rest shortly. In terms of actually playing this game, many of the mechanics established in the previous Marvel and Capcom crossover games make a welcome return here. Expectedly at the game's heart, this is a traditional fighter, however several additional elements are included that enhance the action, including the good old tag team mechanics and aerial combat, which we have already touched on earlier in the video. Hyper combos are also back, however combat wise there is one major shift in gameplay. Remember the variable assists we talked about when covering Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, where the player could call upon their off-screen characters and perform a special attack? Well, this feature has been removed. Instead, we have in its place a guest character special partner system, which brings me on to talking about what guest characters actually are. To put it simply, on top of the characters we have already discussed, there are a further 20 which are known as guest characters. These include some pretty famous faces, such as Cyclops, Jubilee, Thor, and even bloody Arthur from Ghosts and Goblins. These characters are drawn upon for extra support during battles, and are randomly allocated to players prior to a fight. These can be called upon a few times per bout, and can be used when executing new techniques that made their debut in this game, such as variable crosses, aka the duo team attacks. A variable cross allows you to attack your opponent with both characters at the same time for a limited period, essentially double team maneuvers. Building on the newness, the game features an all-new soundtrack that mixes a range of entirely new melodies with remixes of long-established tracks that have been featured in previous Capcom games. Along with the musical changes, the game also introduced all new stage backdrops, a hugely welcome change when you take into account that X-Men vs Street Fighter and Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter lazily both included the same stages, despite being marketed as different games. In addition to the new fighting mechanics, Apocalypse and Cyber Akuma, who were end bosses in the previous game, have been removed. In their place is an all-new final encounter against Onslaught, who originates from the X-Men series. This fight with Onslaught is notorious for being amongst the most difficult bosses in fighting games, and is considered by many to be quite simply the hardest boss in the series. He can perform attacks that do colossal damage, many of which are inescapable. He has two challenging forms, the first of which is tall and highly evasive, the second of which can fly around the background and take up most of the screen. Despite his huge, ominous presence, only a small part of his body is vulnerable to damage, making this even more challenging. All in all, this arcade game includes plenty of new content that greatly separates Marvel vs Capcom to all the crossover games that came before it. But what for the console ports? Let's take a deep dive look. Now, with previous entries in the series, they have been ported over to the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, with the Saturn versions of the game massively outperforming the entries found on the PlayStation. By this point in time, Sega had released an all-new home console in the form of a Sega Dreamcast. So this time around, Capcom had even more power at their disposal when bringing this arcade game home. The arcade version of the game, like its predecessor, was developed for the CP System 2 arcade hardware, with it being revealed that it would be ported over to the Dreamcast during the 1998 Tokyo Game Show. This version of the game would be particularly special, as it would feature a mode known as Cross Fever, which would allow up to 4 separate players to compete in the same tag team matches simultaneously. The Dreamcast version of the game, which was ported to the Dreamcast in 1999, would go on to receive rave reviews from journalists, such as GameSpot stating, "Graphically, Marvel vs Capcom looks terrific, and once and for all proves that the Dreamcast can definitely do justice to 2D games. Even when 4 characters are on screen, filling the arena with projectiles, while the background goes crazy, the game doesn't slow down a bit. The utter lack of load times keeps the game moving along at a nice, brisk pace. The soundtrack, which comprises music from all sorts of different Capcom games, is unmatched. The game's sound effects are also crystal clear and extremely well done. The copious use of stereo separation helps make the audio perfect. While I wouldn't call Marvel vs Capcom the most balanced fighting game in the world, it makes up for its shortcomings by simply being a whole lot of fun. After pumping out inferior versus games for a few years now, Capcom have finally gotten it right. Marvel vs Capcom is everything you'd expect from an over-the-top, ultra-flashy fighter, and then some. IGN had equal praise for the game, particularly in the graphical department. They were very impressed with the game's art style, and expressed this by saying, "Everything from the way Venom moves his tongue to Gambit's trenchcoat blowing in the wind is done with such precision that feasting your eyes upon it is more like experiencing a Saturday morning cartoon than a video game. At even the most frantic moments of combo madness, the backgrounds and characters move just as fluidly as they did before the insanity began. In fact, it's so visually orgasmic that I couldn't help but smile and smile big whenever something cool happened. 32-bit systems can't do this stuff, folks." IGN went on to praise all the modes of gameplay this version of the game includes, such as the return of survival mode and the introduction of Cross Fever. To summarise, they stated, taking everything into consideration, Marvel vs Capcom is an excellent post-launch purchase. With the mini glut of fighting titles available for the system by the end of October, this is definitely one of your better choices, if not the best. It's certainly the best 2D title on the system until Street Fighter Alpha 3 rolls into town, so don't pass this one up. So as demonstrated by the Dreamcast version of Marvel vs. Capcom's universal praise, the game is not only arcade perfect, but offers a range of play modes that can only be experienced in this version of the game, arguably making this game better than what can be experienced in the arcades, which to be frank was what the Sega Dreamcast was all about. The platform was far ahead of its time and in many ways more innovative than many systems that preceded it several years later. I'm looking at you, Nintendo GameCube. Now, moving away from the Dreamcast version of a game, we have to also touch on the PlayStation version. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in a world where we had the ultra slick, fairly priced Sega Dreamcast available to experience at home, the majority of gamers skipped it and just stuck with the feeble PS1 instead. Fortunately, I was not one of those people, but a lot of people denied themselves the magic of the world's most powerful game console. So with most gamers of the age being tight-fisted and saving their money for the non-existent yet PS2, they stuck with the humble 32-bit PlayStation. With the PlayStation's user base being so large, Capcom's hand would be forced once again to create a port of their demanding 2D sprite-based game for a system that was generally terrible at handling them. We've already discussed at length when discussing X-Men vs Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter about how the PS1 simply wasn't capable of holding 4 different sets of sprite animations for fighting game characters in its working memory simultaneously. This meant that one of the main draws of the series, being tag team matches involving 4 different beloved characters, simply wasn't possible on the hardware. But to be fair to Capcom, they would at least get better at producing PlayStation versions of these fighting games with each passing title, with Marvel vs Capcom being by far the most refined of the bunch. Additional familiar issues return, such as certain characters having missing animation frames, long load times existing, and of course a lack of proper tag action, but the game offers a lot more differences than it is often credited for. Known as Marvel vs Capcom Clash of Superheroes EX Edition in Japan, it carries the EX branding in the nation, as it is essentially a different game to what can be found in arcades. Rather than simply just being a poor imitation of its arcade counterpart, it seems Capcom would try harder to make this game stand out and be different from the crossover games that had previously been ripped apart for the PlayStation by critics. As an EX game, the title obviously already had elements that separated it from its source game, most notably the one-on-one round-based matches. For the bouts in this game, a number of mechanical changes were implemented to separate gameplay further, with differences added that an argument could be made were actually for the betterment of the port this time around, rather than simply due to system limitations. In fact, some new features for the EX edition are so extensive, it can be argued that this port served as a testing ground for mechanics and features that would later be a huge part of Marvel vs Capcom 2. The craziest example of this relates to the fact that the EX version of the game contains delayed hyper combos. DHCs would play an integral part in Marvel vs Capcom 2's play, and describe when you cancel the super attack of your point character with a super from the next character. In this version of the game, fighters can also cancel hyper combos into another hyper combo, essentially meaning the whole experience gives players more things that they can do in combat to somewhat make up for the lack of tag team action. Due to this, there are a number of move combinations that can only be performed in this version of the game. For example, in the PlayStation port, Mega Man gets a secret third hyper combo based on his ending, Onslaught's Magnetic Shockwave. To use it, one has to win the game with him, and then choose him while holding the select button. In fact, lots of examples can be found online of players performing all sorts of weird and wonderful attack combinations that can only be performed in this very specific version of the game. Further changes include a new zoom-in effect when fighters perform air combos, a feature known as dynamic mode, which if players find too distracting, they can manually turn off. There are also more palette swaps on offer, allowing gamers to play as fighters in more different attires than in other versions. When we consider that the PlayStation version of the game was never going to fare as critically well as its Sega Dreamcast counterpart, it is really cool to go back and see that rather than just pushing out another underappreciated PlayStation conversion of a crossover game, Capcom appear to have used this moment as an opportunity to experiment with mechanics to utilise in the future, resulting in a video game that offers something different than other EX crossover games that came before it. When it comes to Marvel vs Capcom reaching home systems, the 2D power class divide between Sega and Sony hardware was greater than ever, which makes it all the cooler to see that they went an extra mile with the PlayStation version to give it some saving graces over other iterations of the game. In my mind, Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes was another significant step forward in relation to the evolution of the Marvel vs. Capcom series overall. This game was certainly the most ambitious crossover event in history to date, and a significant chapter in gaming history right up until this very day. This was, after all, the game that solidified the Marvel vs. Capcom name as a brand of fighting game. But what is even more impressive, the best was still to come.
Ready?
Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes.
Rather than showing off a ton of fighting like in previous introductions, I guess Capcom must have felt that the brand was now in a strong enough position that rather than instantly showing off gameplay, they would instead tout the insane amount of new gameplay features and mechanics that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 brought to the table. This includes revealing a ludicrously large lineup of fighters in this jazzy sequence. So let's begin getting down to the nitty gritty and discussing in depth what can be found within. Reflecting back on what came before this one, there were minor mechanical differences between all the previous games, but the most significant change between each was simply the roster of characters available. The 3 titles offered less than 20 playable characters each, but had a different lineup depending on the game's theme. So the next game would have to be something bigger and grander than ever before. Now perhaps the obvious move for Capcom to make would be to make Marvel vs. Capcom 2 a polygonal fighting game. But thankfully the company would instead opt to make an outrageously refined sprite-based fighter, which was nice. But unlike with the previous efforts, the backgrounds and visual effects would be rendered in 3D this time, giving a game a distinct look against the title's predecessors. This makes the game the first in the franchise to feature a 2.5D graphical style, and beautiful it is. Before we talk about the amount of mechanical changes and most this epic game received, let's talk about the bloody roster, as in my opinion it is one of the most incredible things about this game, if not one of the most incredible things in gaming full stop. The selection of fighters to choose from in this one is amazing. You start the game out with a character selection of 24, but there are a further 32 to unlock, all in all giving you a complete roster of a whopping 56 characters. A choice of fighters that was so large it was almost unheard of in other fighting games. Sheer lunacy, but lunacy I certainly appreciated. This game's exciting roster would see a return of most of the characters from the previous Capcom vs games, along with characters who had not been seen in fighting games since the likes of X-Men Children of the Atom, and Marvel superheroes such as Psylocke and Iron Man making welcomed returns to the mix for example. But of course, all of this fighter-wise was just the tip of the iceberg, as the game was packed full of complete newcomers as well. So let's talk about some of these. Firstly, on the Marvel side of things, we have 2 new playable characters. These consist of Cable, the son of Cyclops, and his first wife Madeline Pryor. Cable was a popular character who was nice to see in the game. In a more off-the-wall choice, but one I appreciate, we then have Marrow, a mutant whose bones grow out of her skin which can be removed from her body, providing her with potential knives and clubs as well as body armour. Epic. There are even more new fighters on the Capcom side of things too, so let's run through each of them. First we have a Mingo, who has never even appeared in games outside of the Capcom Vs series. Essentially, a Mingo is a sentient cactus man hybrid with a large rotund belly who dresses in Mexican apparel and carries a guitar around with him. Like a Pokemon, his only form of speech is repeating his own name over and over again, which raises the point, is this bugger a Pokemon? A Mingo has an arsenal of very unique attacks at his disposal. This includes a special attack known as the Shout of the Wind, which involved a Mingo managing to turn himself into a ball in order to hurl himself at opponents. Ridiculous. There has been rumours that he is a rejected Darkstalkers character, whereas other sources point to his game being cancelled. Either way, he is an oddity who is appreciated. Also, about a game of their own, we have Ruby Hart, a French-speaking pirate captain who earned a prominent reputation sailing the seas. Believe it or not, she was created to be one of this title's main protagonists, with her having a major role in the game's crazy story. While there is clearly no reason for this title to really need a story, it has one nonetheless, and Ruby's heart is, well, at the heart of it. According to the game's plot, this French-speaking pirate has a fiery reputation that is well known throughout the Seven Seas. Like any good pirate, Ruby is said to be a treasure hunter, who along with her crew on the flying ship named the Partnier, the group are constantly on the lookout for things of value to add to her collection. She has lots of crazy attacks, including the Partnier that involves her summoning her ship, then ramming her opponents with it, and shooting cannonballs at them. She also has a crazy combo whereby Ruby's crew drop a barrel on top of opponents' heads, allowing her to throw blades at their trapped bodies. If this attack looks familiar to you, that's because it is, as it is a reference to the popular children's board game known as Pop-Up Pirate, which, like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 itself, is also a Japanese game. As for this strange character who felt like they seemingly came out of nowhere to be included in this now legendary title, according to Capcom's old community manager Seth Killian, he has stated in the past that she was actually an old rejected concept character who was produced to be part of the Darkstalkers series, a fact that at a later date Yoshinori Ono of Street Fighter producing fame would also back up. It's inclusions like this which make Marvel vs. Capcom 2 feel even more off of the wall than other games. While on the subject of Darkstalkers, Morrigan returns to the Versus franchise, but this time Anakara's baby Bonnie Hood and Felicia join her, enhancing Darkstalkers' prominence within the Capcom vs. series. Mega Man and Roll are back too, but this time joined by characters from Mega Man Legends series of all places, which I guess was still relevant around this game's release. So from the Mega Man universe, the new additions to the roster include Tron Bonne, the anti-hero member of the Bonne family of air pirates, who had received a Capcom game in her own right titled The Misadventures of Tron Bonne previously. Joining her there is also Servbot, one of the many all-purpose support robots that Tron Bonne built in the Legends series. In terms of more off-the-wall additions, one of the most surprising roster members added was Sun. Sun, although created specifically for Marvel vs. Capcom 2, she is at least connected to another Capcom game. This small monkey girl is described to be the daughter of the original Sun, a male character who appeared in the 1984 arcade title of the same name. The 2D side-scrolling platformer like Dragon Ball is loosely based on the Chinese novel known as Journey to the West, a quirky character to include in a game and a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. As for new playable characters, finally we have Jill Valentine, whose addition would be no surprise when considering Resident Evil's massive success during the 90s. The anime art style she is depicted in this game is also massively refreshing and different from her appearances in any games previously, all in all making her one of my favourite additions to Marvel vs. Capcom's roster. So now we have gotten through talking about all these new fighters, let's begin talking about the development of this vast game. As mentioned in previous videos, all the prior Versus games were programmed to run on Capcom System 2 arcade boards, the same boards which would run the Street Fighter Alpha series in the arcades. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, on the other hand, was developed to run on completely different hardware. In fact, this was the first ever fighting game that Capcom would develop themselves that did not utilise the abilities of Capcom's arcade boards. Instead, the game would be created to run on the Sega Naomi arcade board, which used the same electronic components as the Sega Dreamcast. The Naomi had twice as much system memory, twice as much video memory, and 4 times as much sound memory as its home console counterpart. But all in all, this was the perfect hardware to make a game on, that was intended to be ported over to the powerful Sega home console. The game was first announced on December 1st, 1999, and on that same day it was revealed that Japanese home and arcade versions would be compatible via the Dreamcast VMU. The feature announced would allow players to exchange data between the two versions, earning them experience points which could be used to unlock characters, stages and costumes. It was also announced that day that the game would feature online play between Dreamcast players, which was available through a network known as a matching service. Due to technical limitations, this feature was removed from all international ports of the Dreamcast game though. Thanks to the technical similarities between the Naomi and the Dreamcast, it would only be a matter of months in Japan before the game's arcade version would reach homes in March of 2000. Fortunately, the title would also reach other shores worldwide by the summer of that same year too, meaning the world could enjoy this absolute classic. Now we have covered this game's exciting roster and the hardware this game could be run on, what for the gameplay mechanics that can be found in it? Well, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes brings back tag team fighting, which is why Teddy Long loves this series over any other gaming franchise. Holla 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 players. Play modes this time around deviate though, offering gamers more choice than ever before. Instead of simply picking 2 fighters for yourself to face off against other tag teams with, we can now choose 3 to face off against teams of opponents in 3-on-3 combat, instantly establishing a practical purpose for the game's massive roster of fighters. How awesome. Like in previous games, if a damaged character tags out, they could slowly regenerate health when not in play, instantly adding more strategy to this madness. The oddness of a variable system would also make a return in this game, however it is more refined this time around. The variable system mechanic first introduced in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter allow players to call upon their off-screen teammates to join their currently selected characters to perform a single special move to aid them. All characters also have 3 assists, varying from projectile moves to healing techniques. The hyper combo gauge also returns, gradually filling as players both deal and receive damage. Once this is full, characters can use this power again to perform hyper combos that deal heavy damage. Using the meter, the player can also perform delay types of combos that execute multiple hyper combos simultaneously, and variable combinations, allowing the player to use all 3 of their characters to perform hyper combos simultaneously. Absolute mayhem. Other mechanical changes include snapback, which forces opponents to switch between characters. The game's actual controls have been modified too, changing from a title with 6 different attack buttons to 4 attack buttons and 2 assist ones. This move is said to have made the game more accessible to casual players. The game would obviously feature both single and multiplayer modes of play, which you would expect from an arcade fighter from the period. The game's arcade mode obviously and traditionally consists of a player fighting through various encounters until finally reaching the game's end boss. But before reaching such a destination, the player must defeat 7 teams of 3 to be able to take on the game's main villain. The final boss fight takes place against Abyss, who in typical final boss fashion has 3 different forms you must defeat. In this particular instance, the 3 forms also allow for the 3-on-3 playstyle of the game to persist in some way throughout the fight. Abyss is a character created specifically for this game, which happens to be a legendary creature forgotten by time and is believed to be just a fairy tale. Abyss is said to be a forbidden weapon sealed away in an underground temple where it's been told that for centuries it has been in a deep sleep. According to the game's lore, Ruby Hart was the one who accidentally awoke this character, who as a result would transport the Capcom and Marvel fighters via an airship to help stop it. If the game's arcade mode is not enough for you, and you want to hone your skills, the title also offers players a training mode, which allows them to practice moves and combos whilst not in direct competitive combat. On top of this, there is also a score attack mode, which is similar to arcade mode, only where the player's primary objective is to get as high a score as possible without the need for a continue. The original arcade game also contains an experience system, giving players an incentive to unlock hidden characters, but the Dreamcast version switches this out for what is known as a secret factor menu. When perusing this menu, players can browse this feature and purchase characters, costumes and stages using the points they earn throughout their playthrough. This element of the game gives the title a level of single-player replayability that's arguably a lot higher than with previous entries in the Capcom vs series, or any of the previous Street Fighter games for that matter too. You can get a sense of progression with Marvel vs Capcom 2, which is different from simply getting as good at it as possible. The quest for unlockables is a great incentive to keep players coming back, wondering what else the game has to offer, and a tempting prospect for completionists who enjoy trying to attain everything within the game. To me, this is the kind of feature that should be in every game, let alone just fighters, as it is an easy incentive and a pat on the back to keep going. But then again, most greedy publishers and developers prefer to just put additional content behind paywalls instead nowadays, so unlockables you attain through skill or resilience are a dying gaming feature as of now. But if you like this sort of thing, Marvel vs Capcom 2 on the Dreamcast gives it to you. Now that we have gone through a rundown of the game and its many features, let's hear what some journalists and critics thought of the game on release. Did they like the game as much as many people do today, or were opinions a little different back then? Let's find out. GameSpot reviewed the game favourably, stating, "The over-the-top nature of Marvel vs Capcom 2 makes the other Versus games look subdued by comparison. Like its predecessor, it isn't the most balanced game in the world, but that doesn't keep it from being a great deal of fun. Fans of the off-kilter action found in the previous Versus games will surely be pleased with Marvel vs Capcom 2, as it represents the first major set of changes the series has ever seen." IGN would lump a ton of praise on the title too, stating, "Capcom sets a new watermark in the Versus series of fighters. All fighting fans must have this game. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 proves to be one of the best fighting games out there, one of the Dreamcast's most sparkling gems and an awesome experience. Other publications would carry on piling praise onto the game, with the Daily Radar proclaiming the title to be the most fun 2D fighting game of all time, and Hot Games echoes this sentiment by stating it's the best 2D fighting game ever made. So from ploughing through these game reviews from well over 20 years ago, it seems that a common consensus amongst journalists was that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was one of the greatest 2D fighting games ever made by that point, even if it didn't take itself as seriously as many of the others. Fast forward to 2002 and the Sega Dreamcast was dead. Sega had officially announced that they would be retiring from the hardware industry and future Capcom games would no longer be appearing on Sega systems. It was a damn shame considering that previous versions of their fighting games on those platforms had been the best around for quite some time. This fallout would result in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 receiving two ports, one version for the PlayStation 2 and the other for the Microsoft Xbox, both announced at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 2002. Once again, like the Dreamcast version of the game, online support would remain exclusive to Japan, despite this being 2 years removed from the game's previous release. GameSpot would once again cover it, stating, "The game had been perfectly translated for new consoles," but also commented that the game's graphics and art style was nowhere near as impressive looking as they were 2 years prior, saying, "The contrast between 2D and 3D doesn't work quite as well as you might like, and the resulting clash makes for sharp looking backgrounds and relatively pixelated character sprites," which, to be fair to GameSpot, is a fair point, as a strong case could be made that the whole game may have aged even better if it was all in simple 2D, although I must comment I still quite like these graphical effects. Although GameSpot still looked at the game very favourably, they no longer looked at this as one of the greatest 2D fighters ever, and would even go as far as to state that it has been surpassed on nearly every front since its original release. Games like Guilty Gear X have shown freshly animated and impressively sharp 2D sprites, and Capcom's later releases like Capcom vs. SNK 2 are simply better games in almost every imaginable way. With regards to the 2002 release, they would summarise with, if you're a hardcore fan of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, yet somehow missed the Dreamcast version when it was originally released, this game is a port that you will definitely enjoy, but anyone else can find better fighting games on the market. Personally, over 20 years removed from this re-release, I couldn't disagree more with GameSpot's take, as Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Capcom vs. SNK 2 are too different really to even properly compare, as the Marvel offering is more of a fun chaotic party style game you want to play to have a laugh with friends with, where the latter feels certainly more engineered for gamers whose interests focus more on balance and competition. IGN would give the game praise similar to their review 2 years earlier, although they were sorely disappointed with the lack of online play with the Western releases of the game. This thing was particularly sore when you consider the rise of Xbox Live. They would also criticise the load times compared to what could be found on the Dreamcast. Another interesting point to note is that unlike GameSpot, IGN would state that the game even beats out the later released Capcom vs. SNK franchise. I guess illustrating how subjective these reviews actually are, and how all of us ultimately need to make our own judgments on many games. The game would resurface again on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in the following generation. The reason for this was mainly because a company known as Backbone Entertainment had developed Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix for the systems in 2008, a game that resulted in many people playing competitively online. After this, many fans would request that they release Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on the systems with online play function implemented. As a result, this would become a reality, and the game would be built using the original Dreamcast version's code as a base, the previously most refined home version. Apart from online play, this version would utilise various filter options for character sprites, offering smooth, crisp and classic looks. Widescreen support was also implemented. These versions of the games would be available to purchase until 2013, when Capcom announced that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 would be removed from Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network stores, following the apparent expiration of Capcom's licensing contracts with Marvel Comics. On August 5th, 2022, Arcade 1UP revealed a Marvel vs. Capcom 2 arcade cabinet during the 2022 Evolution Championship Series. The cabinet includes Wi-Fi connectivity for online multiplayer, as well as other games including Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes X-Men Children of the Atom, X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, and even Marvel Superheroes in War of the Gems. Very nice. Over the years, the game has remained popular and now sits amongst the most iconic fighting games ever. Since the game's release, it has always been played at fighting game tournaments too, but despite this, is it one of the greatest fighters ever? Well, to re-drum a point home I made earlier, this sort of question can only be subjectively answered, even when we put criteria in the way to help us reach such a conclusion. But for the sake of entertainment, here are my personal thoughts on the matter anyway. I certainly think it is absolutely amazing. The roster is massive, the 3-on-3 mechanics were innovative, and simplified controls made the game more accessible to players of all skill levels. To top this off, the crazy amount of unlockables give this game tons of replay value for those who enjoy a single player completionist experience. In many ways, this fighting game offered more than any fighter previously. Some criticise the game for being unbalanced, but then again the Versus series is not meant to be about balance in the first place. It's about chaos and fun, which this game offers in abundance. It is about different strokes for different folks, but I can see why many people would get more enjoyment out of this game than many others. This title feels huge. Pair all of the elements together that make Marvel vs. Capcom 2 so great, then this is why it is the ultimate dream game, in my opinion. In order to fully appreciate the golden era of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, we also need to turn our attention to the excellent Punisher game. This official member of the Marvel vs. Capcom Collection started it all, and we would not have gotten any of the other titles if it were not for this one. So let's jump straight in and look at this underrated classic's historical past. After the huge steps forward in the beat-em-up genre that Technos had made with their creation of the Double Dragon series in the 1980s, various development houses wanted to replicate the economic success and gameplay experience. One of these companies was of course Capcom, releasing Final Fight in 1989 and refining the broader experience even further with their game, which took influence from the movie Streets of Fire. The leaps forward Capcom made with Final Fight would result in many beat-em-ups from the company, including other games we've looked at in depth before on here, such as Captain Commando, Alien vs Predator and Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. All of these games were critically well received, and along with Konami and Sega, Capcom became one of the world leaders in creating games of this ilk. So holding such thoughts, it is not surprising that Marvel Comics would allow all three of these companies to develop beat-em-ups using various superheroes from their IP catalogue. After all, Marvel and beat-em-ups were a match made in heaven. In fact, when it comes to Marvel Comics in the world of gaming, despite there being a lot of gems to play, they did not appear to be very fussy regarding who they did business with. Provided the company could make money from their IP when used for various gaming projects, they were pretty much happy to work with a variety of different developers and publishers. Despite this, when it came to console gaming, Marvel Comics appeared to work almost exclusively with Acclaim between 1990 and 1994, often publishing Marvel games under the LJN brand, which they also happen to own. If you have watched previous content covering games of old, you will know how inconsistent this publisher was when it came to quality. They would chop and change which development house handled the project on a whim, and would often rush out broken games as quickly as possible, relying on the success of a TV or movie license more than their actual quality of work. This resulted in Marvel console games from the period varying in quality significantly. As mentioned, Sega, Konami and Capcom would all publish fantastic Marvel games during this period, with games they had developed for the arcade format, a medium which was not choked by Acclaim's licensing stranglehold. As for Capcom, their first ever work using the Marvel comic book character would involve the Punisher. The Punisher first popped up in the Amazing Spider-Man comic book series in 1974. The character, created by writer Jerry Conway, artist John Romita Sr. and Ross Andrew, was a Sicilian-American vigilante who employed murder, kidnapping, extortion, coercion, threats of violence and torture in his campaign against crime. In the Punisher's initial appearance, he appeared as an antagonist with no qualms about killing gangsters, something that most superheroes of the time refrained from doing. On his arrival, the Punisher was determined to kill Spider-Man, who was wanted for the apparent murder of Norman Osborn. Later, this complex character engaged in extensive soul-searching about what is right. This troubled individual was driven by the deaths of his wife and 2 children, who were killed by the mob for witnessing a killing in New York City's Central Park. The Punisher wages a one-man war on crime while employing various weapons and firearms. Spider-Man, no stranger to torment, concluded that the Punisher's problems made his own seem like a birthday party. The novel character was conceived by Jerry Conway and was mainly inspired by The Executioner, a popular book series created by author Don Pendleton, in which a Vietnam veteran, Mac Bolan, becomes a serial killer of criminals after the mafia-related deaths of his family. Conway states, "I was fascinated by the Don Pendleton Executioner character, which was fairly popular at the time, and I wanted to do something inspired by that." The Punisher was an anomaly in Marvel's cornucopia of characters, and his brutal nature made him a hit with readers. He regularly teamed up with Spider-Man and other heroes such as Captain America and Nightcrawler throughout the 1970s and early 80s. This popularity apparently caught Conway by surprise, as the character was originally not intended to be everlasting. By 1986, the Punisher had his own miniseries, which was popular enough to result in the character receiving his own ongoing comic book series in 1987. The Punisher was so popular that he received 2 spin-off comic book series, The Punisher War Journals, which lasted for 80 issues starting in 1988, and The Punisher War Zone, starting in 1992. The character was on a hot streak for Marvel, so it's no surprise that he would receive his own video games. While Capcom's effort is most fondly remembered, they did not get the first crack at the Punisher. That honour would instead go to the video game content farm Acclaim LJN in 1990. You know, the company who were essentially the Watch Mojo of bad video game publishers in the 80s and 90s. In this one, the player controls the Punisher character from an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, shooting thugs and battling supervillains. The game is often criticised for its terrible controls, resulting in a miserable experience. Acclaim would return in 1991 with a Game Boy title, The Punisher Ultimate Payback, another over-the-shoulder third-person perspective shooter. This game is essentially the NES game, only even more miserable. However, as dismal as these were, there was another Punisher game made back in 1990. Not published by LJN due to being developed for home computers by Microprose, the game was published on the Amiga, Atari ST and DOS formats. Featuring 3 different modes of play, the effort was no better than what LJN could come up with, and the home computer game was full of inconsistent quality, poor control and various bugs. The best fact about this game does not relate to the gameplay at all, but instead the fact that after the release of this title, the Punisher was indexed by the Federal Department for Media Harmful to Young Persons of Germany in a list of games deemed to be a bad influence on younger gamers. So while the game is largely forgotten by many, at least it upset the Germans before video game certification. Finally, in 1993, Japanese Capcom would finally have an opportunity to do the Punisher brand justice. After various Western developers and publishers had dragged the brand through the mud in gaming, the arcade title featured the same beat-em-up gameplay style that many of Capcom's other hits had. However, even more impressively, the Punisher also contained a range of usable weapons and a fantastic comic-style presentation, which helped separate it from the pack. Like all the Capcom beat-em-ups of the period, the Punisher features a basic story illustrated throughout the game, starting with an opening cutscene. Through this medium, the game starts out showcasing the Punisher's origin story, where US Marine Captain Frank Castle witnesses a mob killing while enjoying a picnic with his family in Central Park. Fearing any witnesses, the killers gun down the family. Frank survives, vowing revenge and becoming the Punisher. The game follows the Punisher's vigilante mission for revenge through this side-scrolling beat-em-up. The game was notable at the time of release for featuring a new arcade system that allowed over 10 enemies to appear on screen simultaneously without slowdown, an improvement over earlier Capcom games. Like many classics of the era, the Punisher is cooperative, with a second player controlling S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Nick Fury. The game's controls, like other Capcom brawlers, allow players to perform kicks, throws and punches that can be chained together into combos and special attacks to dispatch foes, allowing progression from stage to stage. Melee weapons also play a large role in this title's combat, which can be acquired through the same means as in other Capcom beat-em-ups, on the floor, in crates and from enemies. All the usual sources. Restorative health pickups also make a welcome return. In terms of fighting, the comic book setting is further emphasised with onomatopoeias such as BLAM, which flash up on the screen as players shoot bullets. The game places a heavier emphasis on firearms than many other games of this style, resulting in a relatively high level of violence for this sort of game, a trait which Alien vs Predator would inherit and push further at a later date. The game begins with the playable characters crashing through the glass roof of an illegal casino in pursuit of the mafia enforcer Bruno Costa, who ordered the killing of Castle's family. Players must take out some generic thugs in this short opening part of the game before the action spills out onto the streets of New York City. Here there are barrels to throw, varied enemy sprites to take out, and multiple weapons to both take and pick up to use in melee action. Players manage to board a moving bus where they find Bruno, but he escapes, leaving players to fight Scully, the first large boss fight of the game. The boss fight features scrolling in the background to help create an illusion of movement, a nice visual effect Capcom used in the train stage of Final Fight 4 years earlier. More smaller enemy sprites join the fray, but this first boss battle is not particularly challenging. After defeating this minor comic book villain, the Punisher interrogates Scully and gets the information he needs, then promptly shoots him. Still on track for Bruno, the Punisher infiltrates the mob's Panther birthday resort in Florida by a water duct. Once out of the pool, we see palm trees in both the background and foreground, helping differentiate the area well. As expected, there's lots of sprites to take out here, with varied weapons including female sprites who, as expected, are dressed in latex, just like in every beat-em-up ever. Always giving away their trampling services for free. What's that all about? Combat continues in the resort's interior, with red carpeted floors illustrating the grandeur, along with suited and booted foes who continually illustrate the exclusivity. Players catch up with Bruno, who is now in the most stereotypical villain room of all time, complete with a huge glass aquarium in the background. All that is missing is sharks with fricking laser beams on their heads and would be full on Dr. Evil. Bruno is suddenly killed by a robot called Guard Droid, who tells Frank that the Kingpin has programmed it to terminate him. Players then have to fight this huge towering mechanical opponent who just happens to have the ability to shoot lasers, making up for the lack of mechanically altered sharks. Next up, the Punisher raids a major drug smuggling ring at a local harbour. The stage, named Waterfront Warfare, places a much heavier emphasis on firearm usage than previous stages, with lots of pickups quickly becoming available. Players are not allowed to get comfortable too quickly though, as tougher Terminator-like mechanical foes surface often throughout the stage. The level also features some nice diagonal scrolling, mixing up the action until players eventually face off against a Bonebreaker, a wheeled opponent who has a range of projectile attacks including missiles and flamethrowers. After defeating this opponent, players indulge in a bonus round which plays similarly to the barrel smashing rounds in Street Fighter 2. Only in this Capcom classic, players can use guns due to the whole story taking place in the USA, the gun crime capital and murder capital of the entire Western world, because Second Amendment. Stage 5 takes place in the Kingpin's poppy field at a cave in Arizona, presenting a setting that is certainly a lot more grown up than anything found in the X-Men Konami arcade title. There are mining tracks down here that players can walk along as they shoot foes. Combat shifts to a moving train, with the rest of the stage featuring plenty of variety and great scrolling effects before players take on Bushwhacker, the commander of this freight train. This opponent can transform his arm into a Mega Man-like blaster, accompanied by many enemy sprites. Once defeated, players can progress. The Kingpin has had enough of the Punisher's nonsense, so he puts a contract on his head. This stage sees players wading through excrement in the sewers, a perfect visual metaphor for trying to find good games published using Marvel licenses from this time. There are many enemies to take down here, and some nice visual effects as players trudge through this filth. When players finally escape the sewers, the game contrasts the pleasantness of being outside by landing players in a lush green forest. We could be in the wonderful world of Cadillacs and dinosaurs right now instead. As players progress, the level of challenge slowly ramps up as more and more sprites appear on screen. The boss of the area though is a bit of a cop-out, as players have to fight Guard Droid 2. Basically just a red palette swap of the first Guard Droid boss, Lazy. The final stage, known as the Last Punishment, sees players arrive in a Trump Tower-like setting, similar to the closing stages of most beat-em-ups, where the final boss literally rolls out the red carpet for the arriving players. If you have played any beat-em-ups, you know what to expect here. Ridiculous amounts of enemy sprites all over the place to take out. And since we have not had one thus far in the game, a bloody lift section, which, as I point out in every video, would be illegal to make a beat-em-up without. After ascending the lift, players end up in a mechanical factory-like boiler room, another trope of the genre to add to our checklist. Atop the tower, players finally face the Kingpin, the fattest of all fatty boom booms. After defeating this long life-gauged opponent, the building begins to shake as the Punisher and Nick Fury escape before it collapses. In the game's closing moments, we learn that 355 criminals died in the collapse, but the Kingpin's body was never found, allowing the story to end while maintaining the comic book series status quo. As you can see from the gameplay we just looked at, the Punisher ticks all the right boxes to be a member of the beat-em-up elite. The game features fun combat, great cartoon visuals, plenty of melee weapons, and even a more mature theme than many titles that came before it. The game's only weak point is that it only offers 2-player support, whereas many other games of the era offered up to 4-player cooperative play, or in X-Men's case, 6-player. While Konami's X-Men game is bright, colourful and very comic bookish, the Punisher feels more dark and gritty, reflecting Frank Castle himself. Capcom delivered a perfect atmospheric experience to represent the Punisher franchise. Game Power gave the arcade version of the Punisher a perfect score for the game's fun factor, remarking that its outstanding feature is its gorgeous graphics which capture the dark, somber mood of the Punisher comic books. GameFan reviewer wrote that the Punisher proved to be everything they dreamed of in a traditional Final Fight style game, describing it as the greatest side-scrolling fighting game ever and the bloodiest, goriest fighting game since Mortal Kombat. Clearly very impressed with Capcom's work on this game, it appears that Marvel would allow Capcom the right to publish the next Punisher home title rather than have Acclaim do the job, as they had done with many previous Marvel licensed games. I assume that during this time frame, Capcom in Japan was working on many projects simultaneously, so they outsourced the American company Sculptured Software to develop a home port of the Punisher arcade game. Sculptured Software would be the very same company tasked that year with porting WrestleMania the arcade game to the Mega Drive. And that game could have been better too. The Mega Drive port of the game was massively scaled back from the version that appeared on Capcom System 1 arcade hardware, as expected. In addition to the game's worse graphics and sound, there are fewer varieties of enemies and a smaller number of objects on screen than in the original. Most of the breakable objects in the previous version of the game have also been rendered unbreakable, a further drawback of this version. Amusingly, the game also got Nintendo-style treatment on the Sega system, with lots of censorship implemented. The skimpy latex outfits on the female characters were changed, and Nick Fury lost his trademark cigar, and the violence was visually toned down. This title did not arrive in my region until 1995, making it one of the later Mega Drive games and one of the most valuable and expensive titles collectors often want to add to their collections. However, I don't think the experience matches the ridiculous prices people are willing to pay. Feedback was mixed for the Mega Drive port, with video games calling it a decent exercise in vigilante mayhem that is surprisingly fun, yet fairly standard, while EGM criticised the title, saying the whole game comes across as routine and bland. GamePro outright panned the port, commenting that the special moves are too difficult to pull off, and the sound effects are weak, the gameplay is generic, and the graphics never come close to the coin-op game which it's based on. Next Generation also disliked it, stating not much good can be found in the game, and the person responsible for putting out the Punisher deserves a good spanking. Apart from the butchered Mega Drive version, at one point a PlayStation port was also lined up, which was in development by Crystal Dynamics, the company that held the prestigious accolade of being the first licensed developer for the 3DO. However, sadly, their PlayStation Punisher port was never completed. Despite the home port never being finished and the Mega Drive version being disappointing, Marvel Entertainment loved the Capcom arcade game and were equally impressed with some of Capcom's other work. Bringing the success of the Punisher into account, paired with Capcom's track record for quality, Capcom seemed like a sensible long-term business partner for Marvel Entertainment to work with going forward. The trust generated by the quality delivered with the Punisher, along with the loyalty to the franchise's source material, this marked the beginning of a partnership between Marvel Comics and Capcom, leading to many great things. A Marvel vs. fighting game made sense considering what Capcom had done with Street Fighter 2, resulting in Marvel Entertainment working with Capcom to create the brilliant X-Men fighting game. The contract with Marvel even stipulated that Capcom could include a character from the Street Fighter franchise in the title, leading to the inclusion of Akuma as a secret character. This eventually led to X-Men vs Street Fighter and the many Marvel vs Capcom games that followed it. The Punisher marked the beginning of one of entertainment's most beloved partnerships and crossovers in history. To end this story on a sad note though, despite the Punisher's impact and influence on the Marvel partnership, he would never appear as a playable fighter within any Marvel vs Capcom game, which seems like a massive injustice considering what he was responsible for. In my opinion, some vigilante justice needs to be served against Capcom. However, at least they are finally bringing the ultimate version of this game to many fans. So if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget that you can get many of the different Capcom collections, as well as thousands of AAA titles for next to nothing using my affiliate link. Many of these games are up to 90% off, and every game purchased inspires me to make long boy videos like this. And if you really enjoyed what I did today, please consider backing my projects over on Patreon. If you do, I will love you long time. Cheerio.